She didn't freeze to death in that forest. She burned. Not with fire, with something colder, slower, and far more dangerous. The man who left her there to die in the snow was one of America's most feared crime lords. He had buried bodies from New York to Nevada. He had bought judges, broken senators, and made entire families disappear without a single newspaper headline. He believed he was untouchable. He was wrong. Because the woman he abandoned in that blizzard didn't die. She came back. And she brought his entire empire down with her bare hands. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The storm came in fast off the northern ridge, the way the worst things always do, without warning, without mercy, and without any intention of stopping. Damien Vescari stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the Ashford Pines Resort and watched the pine trees bend under the weight of the wind. He had a glass of 18-year scotch in his right hand, and his left hand rested flat against the cold glass, as if testing whether the world outside was real. The trees whipped hard to the east. The sky had gone the color of a bruise. Snow came sideways now, thick and deliberate, and within 20 minutes the mountain road that wound down from the resort would be completely impassable. He should have felt something, some flicker of concern maybe, some basic human instinct toward caution. He felt nothing except mild irritation. "You're not even going to look at me." The voice came from behind him, near the king-sized bed. Evelyn, his wife of 11 years. She'd said it quietly, the way she said most things, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, which somehow made it worse. Damien didn't turn around. He took a slow sip of scotch and watched a pine bough crack under the ice forming on its needles. "I'm watching the storm," he said. "You've been watching the storm for 40 minutes. It's a big storm." Silence. Then the soft sound of her sitting on the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under her weight. He could see her reflection ghosted in the glass, blonde hair pulled back, posture too straight, jaw set in that particular way she had when she was working very hard not to cry, and winning, barely. Evelyn Cross had been beautiful when he married her. Still was, in a way that had nothing to do with effort. High cheekbones, eyes the color of shallow seawater, a mouth that had once laughed more than it was quiet. She was 41 now. The laugh had been mostly gone for 3 years, maybe 4. He wasn't sure exactly when it had left, only that it had gone the same way the trust had, gradually and then all at once, and he had noticed both departures too late to do anything that mattered. Not that he'd tried. "She's in the room next to ours," Evelyn said. Her voice was flat, controlled. "I heard you in the hallway, last night." Damien set his glass down on the windowsill. He turned. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her own hands, folded in her lap. Her knuckles were pale. 11 years of marriage, and she still held herself together the same way. Spine straight, hands still, expression composed. And he had spent the first 2 years loving that about her, and the last 6 years using it as an excuse to do whatever he wanted, because Evelyn Cross didn't fall apart, which meant in some twisted algebra of his own construction, she didn't need protecting. "Evelyn, don't." She looked up. Her eyes were dry. That was always the most unsettling part. "Don't explain. Don't apologize. I'm past the point where either one means anything." Damien Vescari was 53 years old. He had broken men twice his size. He had sat across tables from the heads of 4 different crime families and stared them down without blinking. He had watched men die and ordered men killed and moved money through 30 different shell corporations across 11 countries, and none of it had ever made his chest feel the particular kind of hollow that Evelyn's dry eyes made him feel right now. He picked up his scotch again. "We can talk when we get back to the city." "We're not getting back to the city tonight. Look at the road." "In the morning, then." "Damien." She said his name like it was a door she was closing. Final. Hinged. "There is no conversation left. There's nothing you can say that changes what this is." He didn't answer. He drank. Her name was Giselle Marceau, 32. French-born, Manhattan-educated, professionally employed as a consultant for Vescari Holdings, one of Damien's many legitimate on-paper enterprises. She had dark hair and a way of walking into a room that suggested she already owned it, which Damien had found irresistible approximately 8 months ago at a company dinner in Midtown, and which he had not found a reason to resist since. She was, at that moment, in room 14, 2 doors down the hall. Evelyn knew this because she had known about Giselle for 6 of those 8 months and had said nothing, done nothing, simply continued running the household and attending charity functions and answering questions about her husband with the appropriate combination of pride and privacy that 11 years of mob-adjacent marriage had taught her to perfect. She had stayed because leaving was not simple. Not when your husband's empire touched everything from the district attorney's office to 3 city council members to the longshoremen's union. Not when the lawyer you might call was on your husband's payroll. Not when you had watched, over 11 years, what happened to people who made Damien Viscari uncomfortable. They didn't always die. Sometimes they just ceased to exist in every way that mattered, financially, professionally, socially. Damien was meticulous. He believed in clean outcomes. Evelyn had stayed because she was carefully calculating the moment when leaving became survivable. She had been wrong about how much time she had. At 9:47 that evening, she put on her coat. She told herself she needed air. That was the reason she gave herself. And it was partially true. The room felt like a box, like the walls were slowly pressurizing, and the storm outside at least had the virtue of being honest about its violence. She put on her coat and her gloves, and she opened the resort's back door and stepped out into the cold. The forest began 30 meters from the building. She could see the tree line through the snow, dark and irregular against the white. She didn't intend to go into the trees, she just wanted to stand in the cold for a few minutes and breathe, and feel something that wasn't the specific suffocation of a marriage ending in slow motion. She didn't go back inside. Not because she chose to stay out. Because within 12 minutes of stepping outside, the wind shifted, the snow came down in a solid wall of white, and Evelyn Cross lost sight of the resort lights entirely. Damien discovered she was gone at 11. He'd gone to check on her, not out of concern exactly, more out of the mechanical habit of a man who had managed people long enough that he tracked their locations the way other men tracked their keys. Evelyn's room was empty. Her coat was gone. Her gloves were gone. He stood in the doorway for a moment, processing. Then he went and knocked on room 14. Giselle answered in a silk robe, half asleep, annoyed. Annoyed. What? Evelyn's not in her room. A beat. Giselle's expression shifted. Not to alarm exactly, but to something calculating. She probably went for a walk. In this? He gestured at the window. The storm outside had gone from severe to genuinely dangerous in the past hour. The wind was screaming now. The snow was a solid white void. She's a grown woman, Damien. He went back to his room. He stood at the window again and looked at the dark tree line. He could barely see it. A person out there right now, without shelter, without heat, in -15 wind chill. A person out there right now would be in serious trouble within the hour. He picked up his phone. Signal was dead. The storm had knocked out the towers. He stood there for 3 full minutes, not moving. This was the moment. He would think about it later, much later, in a federal detention facility with nothing but time, and he would know, with precise and terrible clarity, that this was the moment. 3 minutes at the window. 3 minutes in which the man who had ordered other men's deaths stood paralyzed in front of the one decision that would define everything that came after. He went back to room 14. He didn't go into the forest. Well, by morning, the storm had broken. The resort manager, a nervous man named Harlan Tuck, organized a search party when Damien reported Evelyn missing at 7 a.m. Not because Damien demanded it with any urgency, but because Harlan was the kind of man who took liability very seriously. 8 people went into the forest with flashlights and thermal gear and a dog borrowed from the county ranger station 2 miles down the mountain. They found her coat, just the coat, snagged on a low branch about 400 meters into the tree line, one arm torn where she'd apparently pulled free of it or it had caught, and she'd kept going. The dog lost the scent at a frozen creek bed that cut through the trees heading northeast. The creek had a thin skin of new ice over older ice over black water, and the trail simply stopped there. The assumption, Harlan's assumption, the county ranger's assumption, the assumption that would go into the official missing persons report filed 3 days later, was that Evelyn Viscari had wandered into the storm, become disoriented, and either fallen into the creek or succumbed to hypothermia somewhere beyond the range of the search. The forest out there was vast. Tens of thousands of acres of wilderness, unpopulated, unmapped in its deeper reaches. A body out there in winter would be covered by snowfall within hours. Found in spring, maybe. Or never. Damien accepted this. He accepted it with a composure that Harlan Tuck would later describe to investigators as unsettling, though he would also admit that rich men handled grief differently and he was not in a position to judge. Damien made the appropriate calls. He hired a private search firm for a week, which found nothing. He accepted condolences from the appropriate people. He wore the right expression at the right moments. 6 weeks after Evelyn disappeared, Gisela Marceau moved into the Vescari townhouse on East 73rd Street. 3 months after that, Damien stopped thinking about the forest entirely. He shouldn't have. The forest remembered everything. Evelyn had not fallen into the creek. She had crossed it. That was the first decision she made. Not consciously, not strategically, because at the point she crossed that frozen creek, she had been outside for nearly 2 hours in conditions that had dropped her core body temperature to the edge of dangerous, and her fingers had gone past pain into the particular numbness that precedes something much worse. She crossed the creek because the bank on the far side had dense brush that blocked the wind, and wind was killing her faster than the cold. She got into the brush, and she curled small, and she pressed herself against the base of a fallen pine, and she breathed, just breathed, in and out, counting, keeping the count, because counting meant conscious and conscious meant alive. She did not know how long she stayed there. She did not know what time it was when the light appeared. It was a handheld lantern, old-fashioned, swinging from the grip of a man in layered wool who was not searching for her specifically, but who had been out checking his trap lines, the way he did every morning without exception, and who found her because his dog, a gray mutt named Corbin, shoved its nose into the brush and started barking at her with urgent, muffled excitement. The man's name was Reuben Marsh. He was 60, weathered to the texture of old wood, with a gray beard and hands so calloused they looked like they'd been varnished. He looked at Evelyn, half frozen, coat gone, the early signs of frostbite tracking across her cheekbones and the tips of her fingers, and he did not ask questions. He said, "Can you walk?" And when she nodded, barely, he said, "Then walk." And he walked her 2 miles northeast through the trees to a cluster of structures built so deep in the wilderness that they did not appear on any public map. She would later learn the community was called Verity. It had been there for 30 years, founded by a former military medic named Cassandra Holm, who had decided, after a particular combination of personal and professional disasters, that the institutions of the outside world were not designed to protect people like her, and that the only reliable shelter was one you built yourself. The community was not large, 43 people at its peak, 38 when Evelyn arrived, and it was not a compound in any paranoid sense. It was simply a group of people who had chosen self-sufficiency in its most complete form and had gotten very, very good at it. They grew food. They preserved food. They had a medical clinic run by a former trauma nurse. They had a school for the 12 children born there or brought there young. They had a sauna and a community hall and a library of several thousand books hauled in on sleds over a decade of trips. And they had a rule about new arrivals that Cassandra Holm had established in year 2 and never revised. You stay for 6 weeks before you decide to leave or stay. 6 weeks minimum. That was the rule. Not as captivity, the path out was marked and anyone could take it, but as a requirement of honesty, because Cassandra had learned twice that people who arrived in crisis and left too quickly went back to exactly what had broken them, and came back in worse condition, or didn't come back at all. Evelyn stayed for 6 weeks, then 6 more. Then she stopped counting weeks. Recovery was not poetic. The frostbite took 2 of her left-hand fingertips to the second joint. The trauma nurse, a compact, serious woman named Dara, was precise and unapologetic about it. "You'll lose feeling at the tips of those permanently," Dara told her. "The rest of the hand is fine. You'll adapt." Evelyn adapted. She had to learn how to hold things differently, how to tie knots with the middle and ring finger doing work the index finger used to do automatically, how to grip an axe handle so the pressure distributed correctly. It took 6 weeks just to stop resenting the injury and another month to stop noticing it. By the time spring came, she had stopped noticing most things about her former life. Not because she forgot. She didn't forget. Every morning she woke with Damien's face behind her eyes, that particular expression he'd had at the window. His back to her, scotch in hand, watching the storm that was killing her from the inside of a heated room. And some days the image made her cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature, and some days it made her chest feel like it was full of broken glass, and some days it made her feel nothing at all, which was somehow the worst of the three. But feeling and planning are not the same thing. Cassandra Holm understood this distinction in her bones. She was a woman of extraordinary practical intelligence, not the academic kind, not the kind that came from theory and speculation, but the kind that came from having been in actual danger and having survived it through systematic thought rather than luck. She saw in Evelyn, by that second month, something she recognized, a person whose suffering was organized, not chaotic, organized. "You're not just grieving," Cassandra said one evening in late March, the two of them on the front porch of the main hall, with coffee going cold in their hands, and the snowpack beginning its slow first melt in the southern clearing. "You're cataloging." Evelyn looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Every morning you're out before the others. You walk the same perimeter. You're learning the trails by repetition, not by map." Cassandra's eyes were gray and direct and missed very little. "You're building a picture of this place, how it works, how people move through it, what's defensible and what isn't." A long pause. "Old habits," Evelyn said. "From what?" Evelyn turned her coffee cup in her hands. She was quiet for a long time. The pines around the clearing were dripping steadily now as the afternoon heat worked at the upper snowpack, and somewhere in the trees a woodpecker was hammering at something with mechanical persistence. "My husband's business," she said finally. "I spent 11 years watching how power moved, who held it, how it got transferred, how it got taken." She paused. "I watched carefully because I didn't have any of my own. Watching was the only version of safety available to me." Cassandra said nothing for a moment. Then, "And now?" Evelyn looked at the tree line, at the pale green beginning to show at the tips of the lower branches, at the world starting to come back from under the ice. "Now I'm thinking," she said, "about what I could do with what I watched." The years at Verity did not soften Evelyn Cross. They compressed her. There is a difference, and it matters. Softening is what happens when resistance ends. Compression is what happens when a material is subjected to sustained force and survives. It becomes denser, more structural, more capable of bearing weight than it was before the force was applied. Reuben Marsh taught her tracking, not the romantic kind, not reading broken twigs and whispered footprints in untouched snow the way people described it in novels. Real tracking was math and patience and a detailed understanding of how animals and people moved through space under different conditions of light, temperature, fear, and intention. Reuben taught her to read the difference between a trail left by someone who knew where they were going and a trail left by someone who didn't, and that difference, he said, told you almost everything you needed to know about your subject. Cassandra taught her field medicine and cold weather survival at a level that went past competence into the kind of fluency that sits in muscle memory rather than conscious recall. A man named Otto, who had been a computer systems analyst before some unspecified professional catastrophe had driven him to Verity 8 years prior, taught her everything he knew about financial architecture, how corporations hid money, how shell companies worked, how electronic records could be erased or, more usefully, recovered after someone believed they'd been erased. She asked Otto why he was teaching her this. "Because you're going to need it," he said, without looking up from the screen of the salvaged laptop he kept running off a solar rig on the south wall of his cabin. "Whatever it is you're planning." "I haven't said I'm planning anything." "No." He typed something. "But you asked me last Tuesday how a corporation could transfer assets between entities without creating a traceable record. And this Tuesday you asked me how forensic accountants locate those transfers anyway." He glanced up. "Those are not academic questions." Evelyn was quiet. "I don't need to know what you're planning," Otto said. "I just need to know if you're serious." "I'm serious." "Then pay attention." She paid attention. She left Verity in the early spring of the 4th year, on a morning when the snow was still on the upper ridges, but the lower trails were clear enough to move at pace. She left with a pack, a detailed map of her own construction, 2 changes of clothing, 3 false identities that Otto had built for her from salvaged credentials and careful digital construction, a folder of encrypted files on a thumb drive, and the kind of calm that is indistinguishable from cold if you don't know what you're looking at. Cassandra walked her to the edge of the main trail. "You know you can come back," Cassandra said. "I know. This might take years." "I know that too." Cassandra looked at her for a long moment. She had known Evelyn Cross for 4 years, had watched her arrive half dead and terrified and leave standing straight as a lodgepole pine in still air. She was not a sentimental woman. "Don't become him," Cassandra said. Evelyn stopped walking. She turned. The morning light was coming through the trees at a low angle, catching the particles of ice still suspended in the air from the previous night's frost. And for a moment, everything around them was very still and very bright. "I don't intend to kill him," Evelyn said. "That's not what I meant." Evelyn held her gaze. "I know what you meant," she said. She turned and walked into the trees and didn't look back. Damien's empire, in the years since Evelyn's disappearance, had grown the way cancers grow. Not through brilliant expansion, but through the exploitation of weakness in adjacent systems. He had absorbed 3 smaller operations on the eastern seaboard, absorbed being a polite word for what was actually a combination of strategic violence and financial predation. He had a new arrangement with the Port Authority that moved product through 3 container terminals without inspection. He had a city councilman and a federal prosecutor in sufficient debt to him that their cooperation was a matter of routine. He had, by any external measure, never been more powerful. He had also, by any external measure, never been more afraid. The fear had started small. 18 months after Evelyn's disappearance, a mid-level manager in his financial operation named Caruso had vanished. Not in a way Damien had ordered. Caruso had simply not shown up to a meeting, and his apartment was empty, and his bank account showed a zero balance that had been achieved not through withdrawal, but through a transfer to an account that traced back to a shell company Damien had never heard of. Damien's people investigated. They found nothing. 6 months later, a storage facility in Queens that held, among other things, 3 crates of records that Damien maintained specifically because they were too sensitive to digitize. Physical records, handwritten, coded, but recoverable. That facility burned. The fire marshal determined it was electrical. Damien knew it wasn't. He knew because 2 days before the fire, one of his men had reported a woman in the parking lot across the street, sitting in a gray sedan, watching the facility for approximately 40 minutes before driving away. They hadn't thought to follow her. Small things, individually explicable. Together, over the accumulating months, they formed a pattern that Damien could feel more than he could articulate. The sensation of something systematic happening in his peripheral vision, something that moved when he looked away and stopped when he looked directly. He hired people to investigate. They investigated and came back with nothing concrete. He tightened his inner circle. 2 of the people he cut loose began behaving erratically and were dealt with. He tightened the circle further. Giselle noticed the shift in him. She was not a fool. Whatever else she was not a fool. And she had spent 3 years now embedded in Damien's life with sufficient intimacy to read his moods with precision. She watched him sleep less, drink more carefully, which was its own kind of tell. She watched him standing at windows again, the way he had that night at Ashford Pines. Except now what he seemed to be scanning for was not weather, but threat. "You're scared," she said one night. "I'm careful," he corrected. "You've always been careful. This is different." She studied him. "What happened to that councilman, Petrov?" A pause. "He retired. He was 44. People retire early." Giselle was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is this about Marcus Healy? Because if Marcus flipped..." "Marcus didn't flip." Damien's voice was flat, final. "Enough." But Marcus Healy, who had been one of Damien's 3 most trusted financial intermediaries, had in fact disappeared 4 months ago under circumstances that were troubling in their neatness. His office, a legitimate investment firm in Connecticut that served as one of Viscari Holdings' primary laundering structures, had been wound down over a period of 6 weeks with such bureaucratic precision that by the time Damien's people noticed the pattern, every asset had been moved, every account closed, every filing completed and filed correctly with the appropriate regulatory bodies, and Marcus Healy himself had relocated to a city that Damien's investigators could not identify. Someone with detailed inside knowledge of how the Connecticut operation worked had systematically dismantled it. They'd done it slowly, carefully, over months, in a way designed to look like routine business closure until it was too late to interrupt. Damien had spent 4 months trying to understand who had that knowledge. The list of people who knew the Connecticut operation in sufficient detail to execute that kind of dismantling was very short. Evelyn's name was not on the list. It wasn't on the list because Evelyn was dead. She had frozen to death in a forest 4 years ago. Her official status was missing, presumed deceased, and Damien had filed the appropriate legal paperwork to have her declared dead 18 months after her disappearance, which had involved a sympathetic judge and a modest financial arrangement, and which had allowed him to consolidate their joint assets cleanly. She was dead. He was sure of this. He stood at his window and watched the city below and felt the specific cold that has nothing to do with temperature, and he was sure of this, and he poured another drink, and he went to bed, and he did not sleep well. 3 weeks after Damien fired his head of security and replaced him with a man imported from a firm in Chicago, a woman walked into a law office in Philadelphia under the name Renata Cross and met with an attorney named Sylvie Okafor, who specialized in financial fraud cases with federal implications. The woman who called herself Renata Cross was 45 years old, with blonde hair cut short and practical, and seawater eyes that didn't blink much and didn't warm much, and hands that moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned at some cost to waste nothing. She carried a thumb drive and a manila folder and a posture that Sylvie Okafor would later describe as the most contained person I've ever sat across a desk from. What I have here, Renata Cross said, setting the thumb drive on the desk, represents 4 years of financial architecture. Shell corporations, wire transfers, regulatory filings, bribery payments, asset movements. Everything documented, everything cross-referenced, everything sourced. Sylvie looked at the thumb drive. Against whom? An organization that calls itself Vescari Holdings. The man who runs it is named Damien Vescari. Sylvie's expression did not change, but something behind it did. She was a woman who knew that name. Most people in federal adjacent legal practice on the East Coast knew that name, the way you knew the name of a weather system. Not because you'd been close to it, but because of the destruction in its wake. This is substantial, Sylvie said carefully. It's the beginning, Renata Cross said. I'm not ready to file yet. I'm here to understand the architecture of what comes next. Specifically, I need to understand which agencies have jurisdiction, which prosecutors have the stomach for it, and what it would take to make this airtight. Sylvie studied her. How did you come by this information? A pause. I was very close to the operation for a very long time. Were you a participant? Renata Cross looked at her steadily. I was a wife. The silence in the office was complete for a moment. The hum of the building's ventilation. Traffic outside 17 floors down. Mrs. Vescari is deceased, Sylvie said. Mrs. Vescari, the woman across the desk said, is sitting in your office. Sylvie Okafor did not visibly react. She was a woman who had spent 20 years not visibly reacting to things that would make other people fall off their chairs. She picked up the thumb drive. She looked at it. How long? She said. Another year, Renata Cross said. I need another year. There are pieces still in motion. Sylvie set the drive down carefully and looked across the desk at the woman whose name was not Renata Cross, whose name was Evelyn, who had walked out of a frozen forest with 2 missing fingertips and 4 years of nothing but time and intention, and who was looking back at her with the particular expression of someone who has already decided exactly how this ends and is simply working backward from that conclusion. What are those pieces? Sylvie asked. Evelyn reached into the manila folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the desk. On it were 7 names. These men, Evelyn said, are the foundation Damien stands on, not the ones he controls through fear. Those are already handled. These 7 men chose him. They built him. And they need to understand before this is over exactly what they chose. Sylvie looked at the list. She looked up. When you say handled, the ones he controls through fear, freed, Evelyn said flatly. Not harmed. Freed. Documents delivered, debts documented, leverage removed. Some of them are already cooperating with a parallel investigation through a separate channel. A pause. I'm not building a body count. I'm building a case. Sylvie was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, Philadelphia turned slowly in the afternoon light, 17 floors below them, the streets moving with the indifferent momentum of a city that didn't know what was being assembled in this quiet room by this quiet woman against this particular and consequential man. "A year," Sylvie said finally. 11 months, Evelyn corrected. "I'm on a schedule." Sylvie Okafor picked up her pen. "Then let's not waste time," she said. That night, in a nondescript motel room outside the city, Evelyn Cross sat at a small desk with her laptop open and a cup of coffee growing cold at her elbow. The window was dark. The parking lot outside was empty. The room smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and the specific anonymity of a place where nobody stayed long. She opened an encrypted folder and scrolled to a photograph she had accessed before, many times. Enough times that she could have described it from memory without opening it. It was a surveillance image, grainy, taken from distance, of Damien Vescari standing on the steps of his East 73rd Street townhouse. He was in a suit, mid-conversation with someone outside the frame, one hand raised in a gesture she recognized, the way he made a point, the slightly impatient chopping motion he always used when he thought someone was being slow to understand something obvious. She had known every gesture he made, every habit, every pattern of speech. 11 years. She studied the photograph for a long moment. Not with feeling, exactly. The feeling part came at odd hours, in the dark. And she dealt with it the way she dealt with most things now, which was directly and without indulgence. In the daylight hours, she looked at this photograph and she saw information. She saw a man who thought he was untouchable. She saw a man standing on ground he didn't know was already moving under his feet. She closed the laptop. She finished her coffee. She set her alarm for 5 a.m. She had 11 months left, and she was not going to waste a single day of them. What Damien Vescari did not know, what he could not have known, standing at his Manhattan window with his scotch and his carefully managed paranoia, was that the woman he had left to die in the snow 4 years ago had not simply survived. She had rebuilt herself into the one thing he had never encountered in 30 years of organized crime. An enemy who knew him completely, who felt nothing that would make her reckless, and who had more patience than he had power. The forest had not taken her, it had made her, and she was already inside his walls. 11 months was a long time to be patient. It was also, Evelyn Cross had learned, exactly the right amount of time to be dangerous. She had spent the first 4 months of that final year working through Otto's framework, not from memory, but from the living infrastructure of Damien's operation as it existed now, which was different in specific and important ways from what it had been when she left. Empires don't stand still. They metastasize. New vessels form, old ones calcify or get cut, and the organism reconfigures itself around its own vulnerabilities with the blind persistence of a thing that doesn't know it's sick. Damien's operation had metastasized in the direction of the ports. That was the shift she'd tracked first. The container terminal arrangement, 3 facilities on the eastern seaboard handling product and cash flow through a network of freight forwarding companies that on paper had nothing to do with each other and in practice shared 3 accountants, 1 attorney, and a logistics coordinator named Boyd Renna, who was, in Evelyn's assessment, the single most critical node in the entire network, and the person she had spent 6 weeks cultivating without his knowledge. Boyd Renna was 51, divorced twice, a moderate gambler with a specific weakness for sports betting that had left him carrying debt to a bookie who was, unknown to Boyd, now working for Evelyn. The debt had been quietly purchased 4 months ago for $11,000. The bookie's instructions were simple: keep Boyd current, keep Boyd comfortable, and keep Boyd talking. Boyd talked. He talked because gamblers talk. It's the same impulse, the same need for the release valve of someone else knowing, someone else sharing the weight of the numbers. He talked to the bookie about his job, about the pressure, about the things he moved and the names attached to them that he'd rather not know but knew anyway. Evelyn listened through transcripts the bookie recorded on a device she'd provided, and she built the picture. She was living, during this period, in a studio apartment in Trenton under the name Claire Marsh, borrowed surname, quiet acknowledgement of the man who had pulled her from the brush 4 winters ago. The apartment was small and clean and had a desk and a good lamp and walls covered in printed documents connected by color-coded thread in a pattern that looked, to anyone who might have seen it, like the kind of organized obsession that makes people uncomfortable. Nobody saw it. She worked alone mostly. The few people she'd engaged, Otto's remote assistants, Sylvie in Philadelphia, Three specific individuals she'd identified in Damien's extended network who had their own reasons to want him finished. They knew pieces. None of them knew the whole. That was intentional. She had learned from Damien, over 11 years of close observation, that the most reliable structural weakness in any criminal organization was the person who knew everything. Every organization had one. Usually it was the man at the top, who hoarded knowledge the way other men hoarded money, because knowledge was power, and distributing it felt like dilution. Damien had always known everything about his own operation, which meant, when it fell, it would fall completely. That was the plan. Not to chip away at the edges, not to wound, to wait until every piece was in position and then apply pressure at every point simultaneously, so that when the structure buckled, it buckled all at once. The way a building does when the load-bearing columns go at the same moment and there's nothing left to transfer the weight to. She was, by March of that 11th month, 2 moves from ready. Then Giselle Marceau made a mistake that accelerated everything by 6 weeks. Giselle's mistake was not stupid. That was what made it dangerous. Stupid mistakes are manageable. They produce predictable consequences that can be contained. Giselle's mistake was intelligent, which meant it produced consequences that moved laterally through the system in ways Evelyn hadn't fully anticipated. What Giselle did was this. She hired a private investigator. She hired him not because she suspected Evelyn was alive. She didn't. She had no reason to. But because she had become, over the past 18 months, genuinely frightened. Not of Evelyn. Of Damien. She had watched him tighten, watched the paranoia consolidate into something that made him unpredictable in their private moments. And she had begun, with the practical self-preservation instinct of a woman who had always understood that her position was contingent rather than permanent, to think about exits. The private investigator's name was Frank DeLuca. Giselle hired him to locate assets, specifically assets that Damien held outside the structures she knew about. Accounts or holdings that might be accessible to her in a scenario where she needed to leave quickly and without his cooperation. Frank DeLuca was competent, reasonably discreet, and had no particular loyalties. He was also, as it happened, the same investigator that Damien had used twice in the past 3 years to look into the disappearances within his own organization, which meant Frank DeLuca's name was in Evelyn's files. She found out about Giselle's engagement of DeLuca through the most pedestrian possible mechanism, a credit card transaction that ran through a monitoring flag she'd set up 8 months ago on Giselle's accounts, because Giselle was a thread in this that Evelyn had never fully resolved, and so she'd kept a loose watch on her. When the charge appeared, DeLuca's firm, substantial retainer, Evelyn sat with it for 48 hours. The problem was not that Giselle was looking for exit assets. The problem was that DeLuca was competent, and if Damien's people were also watching Giselle, which, given his current state of paranoia, was not unlikely, then DeLuca's engagement would surface, and when it surfaced, Damien would move against Giselle, and when he moved against Giselle, the internal dynamics of his organization would shift in ways that might close windows. Evelyn still needed open. She needed to talk to Giselle. It was the last thing she wanted to do. She did it anyway. She chose a Tuesday morning in April, when Damien was in a meeting in Midtown that she knew, from Boyd Renna's most recent transcripts, would run until noon. Giselle's routine on Tuesday mornings was consistent: coffee at a place on Lexington, alone, with her phone and whatever she was reading. Consistent routines were a vulnerability, but Evelyn was not going to criticize it under the circumstances, because the consistent routine was precisely what made this conversation possible. She was already at a table in the back when Giselle came in. Giselle ordered at the counter, turned with her cup, and found a woman at the rear table looking directly at her with seawater eyes and short blonde hair and a stillness that stopped Giselle mid-step as though she'd walked into glass. The recognition was not immediate. Then it was. The color left Giselle's face in a single movement, like something draining. She stood very still for 3 full seconds, her coffee cup in both hands, and Evelyn watched the sequence play across her features: shock, disbelief, the rapid recalibration of someone whose understanding of the world has just been fundamentally revised. And then, underneath all of that, like bedrock under topsoil, fear. Evelyn tilted her head slightly toward the empty chair across from her. Giselle sat down. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The coffee shop was half full and loud enough that the ambient noise made privacy possible. Evelyn had chosen the table for exactly this reason. "You're dead," Giselle said. Her voice was almost steady. "I was in the forest for a long time," Evelyn said. "I came out." Damien said, "I know what Damien said." She held Giselle's gaze. "I'm not here about what Damien said. I'm here about Frank DeLuca." Whatever Giselle had been bracing for, it wasn't that. Her expression shifted from fear into something more complicated. "How do you know?" "That doesn't matter. What matters is that you hired someone who Damien has used, which means there is a possibility, not a certainty, but a real possibility, that when Damien's people run their routine checks on DeLuca's client list, and they do periodically, your name will surface." Giselle stared at her. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm informing you. There's a difference." Evelyn kept her voice level. "You're trying to find an exit. I understand that. The exit you're looking for is real. There are assets outside the structures you know about, but DeLuca is not the way to find them without Damien finding out." "And you are?" A pause. The noise of the coffee shop. Someone's espresso machine hissing. "I know where everything is," Evelyn said simply. "I built the record-keeping system for the first 6 years of our marriage, before he decided he didn't need me to anymore." She let that sit. "When this is over, and it is ending, Giselle, I want you to understand that clearly it is over. There will be assets that the federal seizure won't capture. Legitimate assets, properly structured. They can go somewhere specific if the right arrangements are made in advance." Giselle looked at her for a long time. Her coffee sat untouched. "What do you want from me?" she said. "I want you to fire DeLuca today. Tell him the matter is resolved. Pay his invoice in full, and don't contact him again." Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and set a small sealed envelope on the table. "And I want you to hold on to that. Don't open it yet. You'll know when." Giselle looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. "When what?" "When the time is right, you'll receive a phone call from a woman named Sylvie. When she calls, open the envelope and do what it says." "That's it?" "That's it." Giselle's jaw tightened. "And if I go to Damien with this instead?" Evelyn looked at her steadily. Not with anger, not with threat. With something more uncomfortable than either, total, unblinking clarity. "Then you go to Damien," Evelyn said, "and you tell him his dead wife is alive and has spent 4 years building the case that ends his life as he knows it. And you think carefully about what Damien Viscari does to sources of problems, Giselle. You have watched him for 3 years. You know the answer better than I do." The silence between them was different now, weighted differently. Giselle picked up her coffee, drank, set it down. "Fire DeLuca," she said. It wasn't a question anymore. "Today." Giselle stood. She left the envelope on the table, and then she picked it up and put it in her bag, and she walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. Evelyn sat alone for another 5 minutes. She finished her water. She watched the street through the window. She felt nothing she was going to indulge and everything she was going to use. The problem that arrived 3 days later was of a different category entirely. His name was Leon Pruitt, and he had been, until approximately 10 weeks ago, a mid-level operations manager in Damien's organization responsible for coordinating the movement of cash between 3 of the port-adjacent freight companies. He had been, until that same point in time, one of the 7 names on the list Evelyn had given Sylvie Okafor, the list of men who had chosen Damien, who had built him. He had also, as of 6 weeks ago, agreed to cooperate with the parallel federal investigation that Sylvie had been quietly coordinating through a contact at the Financial Crimes Unit. He had been, as of 3 days ago, missing. Evelyn found out from Sylvie, who found out from the federal contact, who told her in the clipped, careful language of someone communicating bad news in an environment where bad news had consequences. Pruitt had missed a scheduled check-in, his phone was dead, and a preliminary check of his apartment showed signs of rushed departure without the specific pattern of someone leaving voluntarily. Evelyn did not panic. She sat with it. She walked through the implications with the methodical coldness she'd trained herself into over 4 years of preparation. If Pruitt had been taken, not warned off, not run, but taken, then one of 2 things was true. Either Damien's people had identified him as a federal contact, which meant the parallel investigation was compromised, or Damien's people had identified him as a contact of Evelyn's, which meant something far worse. that somewhere in her architecture there was a leak she hadn't found. She called Otto on the encrypted line. "Pruitt," she said. A pause. She heard him typing. "I saw. What's your read?" His communications were clean on my end. Nothing came through any channel I built. More typing. But his phone, his personal phone, not the one we gave him, if he used it for anything related to your arrangement, he was told not to. People are told things. The line was quiet for a moment. "Find out if he used it," she said. "I'm already looking." A pause. "Evelyn, if Damien has him, I know." The timeline, "I know, Otto." Her voice was flat, controlled. The way she'd trained it to be when the pressure came. "Find the phone records. I'll handle the rest." She ended the call. She stood in the center of her Trenton apartment with the color-coded map of Damien's empire on the wall in front of her. And she thought about Leon Pruitt, and she thought about the 6 weeks she'd been planning to use for the final positioning, and she thought about the fact that those 6 weeks might not exist anymore. She thought about what Cassandra Holm had told her on the morning she left Verity. Don't become him. She had promised herself she wouldn't, not in the way Cassandra meant, not through violence, not through the specific ruthlessness of a person who starts dismantling their own humanity in the service of an objective and doesn't notice how much they've dismantled until there's nothing left to stand on. But there was a version of Cassandra's warning that she hadn't fully reckoned with until this moment, standing in a Trenton studio apartment with the evidence of 4 years' work on her walls and a missing man somewhere in Damien's machinery. She had been, for 4 years, operating with the cold detachment of someone who had successfully separated strategy from emotion. She had told herself this was discipline. She had told herself this was necessary. She was starting to wonder if it was also something more dangerous. If the compression that Verity had made of her had gone past structural integrity into something that didn't bend anymore. Something that might crack rather than flex when the load shifted. She took a breath. She was still thinking about this when her encrypted phone rang. Not Otto's line. The other line. The one only 3 people had the number to. She answered. "It's Sylvie." A pause, and something in Sylvie's voice that Evelyn had not heard in their 11 months of working together. A hairline crack in the composure. "We have a situation. Pruitt." Not just Pruitt. A breath. "My federal contact, Agent Harmon, he's been pulled off the case. Reassigned. Effective this morning. No explanation given through official channels." Another pause. "Damien has someone inside the financial crimes unit, someone senior enough to reassign a federal agent." Evelyn sat down on the edge of her desk chair. She did not say anything for a moment. Outside her window, Trenton moved with its usual indifferent noise, traffic, a horn, the distant percussion of a city that didn't know and didn't care about any of this. "How long have you known?" Evelyn said. "I found out an hour ago." "That's not what I asked." A longer pause. "I suspected something 2 months ago," Sylvie said. "A filing that moved through channels faster than it should have. I told myself it was coincidence." Evelyn absorbed this. Held it. Let the implications arrange themselves. An inside contact in the federal unit changed the architecture of everything. Not fatally. The case Sylvie had been building ran through enough parallel channels that one compromised investigator didn't collapse it. But it changed the timeline, and it changed the exposure, and it meant that the careful, patient, surgical approach she had spent 4 years constructing needed to be partially abandoned in favor of something faster and less elegant. Faster and less elegant meant more risk. More risk meant more exposure for the people she'd brought into this. She thought about Sylvie, about Otto, about the 3 individuals in Damien's extended network who were currently positioned as her inside sources and whose safety depended on Damien not knowing what was coming until it was already there. "How current is the evidence package?" Evelyn said. 90% complete. The remaining 10% is the direct testimony we were waiting on from Pruitt. Pruitt may not be available." "I know." "What do we have without him?" Sylvie was quiet for a moment, and Evelyn heard her working through it, not stalling, calculating. "Without Pruitt, the port terminal connection is circumstantial. Strong circumstantial, but a good defense attorney puts reasonable doubt on the table and the port charges don't stick. The financial fraud charges hold. The bribery charges hold. The overall case is solid, but the organized crime designation, the RICO component, that becomes harder to establish without someone who is inside the operational tier. RICO. That was the architecture of it, the element that transformed the financial crimes charges from significant to career-ending, empire-ending, no appeal, spend the rest of your life watching the walls closing, in devastating. Without it, Damien would take losses, significant losses. He'd go to prison, probably. Financial fraud at this scale was not a suspended sentence, but he would retain enough that when he came out, if he had the right people in place, enough would remain to rebuild from. Evelyn was not doing this so he could rebuild. She stared at the wall. "We need another inside source," she said. "Someone at Pruitt's level or above." "Do you have someone?" She ran through the list. The 3 remaining inside sources, 2 were below Pruitt's operational tier, 1 was lateral. None of them had the direct knowledge of the port operations that the RICO designation required, except one person who wasn't on any list she'd made. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Give me 48 hours, she said. "Evelyn, 48 hours, Sylvie." She stood up. "Don't contact Harmon's replacement until I say. Don't file anything. Don't move." "What are you going to do?" She was already looking at her coat on the hook by the door, at her bag. At the keys to the car she kept parked 2 blocks away under the Claire Marsh registration. "The one thing I didn't want to do," she said. She ended the call. She put on her coat. She had spent 4 years building a machine precise enough to dismantle an empire without a single body, without becoming the thing she was destroying, without crossing the line that Cassandra had named on a cold morning in the wilderness. She had been meticulous. She had been patient. She had been everything that Damien was not, because that was the point. The point was to beat him by being the opposite of what he was. But Damien had Leon Pruitt somewhere, and he had a federal agent reassigned, and he had people smart enough and placed highly enough to do both of those things, which meant that the machine she'd built was running out of the conditions it needed to operate cleanly, which meant she was going to have to do something she'd spent 4 years refusing to consider. She was going to have to walk into a room with someone who could identify her, not as Renata Cross, not as Claire Marsh, as Evelyn Viscari, the woman who was supposed to be dead. She locked the apartment behind her and walked down the stairs into the late afternoon light, and the city moved around her the way cities do, without knowledge, without recognition, without the first idea that the woman in the gray coat walking toward the parking garage was about to do something that would make every move she'd made for 4 years, either the foundation of something complete or the prelude to her second disappearance, and this time there would be no frozen forest to survive, no Reuben Marsh with a lantern and a gray dog, no community of careful people to hold her while she rebuilt. This time, if she miscalculated, there was nothing on the other side of it. She reached the car. She put her hand on the door handle. The metal was cold under her palm. Not the 2 damaged fingertips, which felt nothing, but the rest of her hand, which felt everything with the specific heightened clarity of a person who has spent 4 years treating every sensation as information. She got in. She started the engine. She pulled out of the garage into the late afternoon traffic of a city that was, as of this moment, the last place anyone who mattered thought she was. She drove north, toward Manhattan, toward the one person inside Damien's world who had the operational knowledge she needed, who had every reason to give it to her, who had been sitting in an East 73rd Street townhouse for 3 years watching the man she'd chosen become someone she was quietly terrified of, and who had, in a coffee shop on Lexington Avenue 3 days ago, put a sealed envelope in her bag and walked out without looking back. Giselle Marceau had not chosen Evelyn, but she had not chosen Damien either, not anymore. And sometimes, Evelyn had learned, the alliances that mattered most were not the ones people made from loyalty. They were the ones people made from the cold, clear-eyed recognition that the ship was going down, and that the only question left was which lifeboat you were on when it did. She drove north through the failing light, and behind her the Trenton apartment sat empty with its walls full of color-coded thread, and somewhere in the architecture of Damien Viscari's empire, a man named Leon Pruitt was in a room without windows, and a federal agent named Harmon was clearing out his desk, and Damien Viscari himself was, she knew, from the schedule Boyd Renna had described, sitting at dinner in a restaurant on the Upper West Side, ordering the same thing he always ordered, feeling the specific paranoia of a powerful man who knows something is wrong but cannot locate it. He was about to find out what was wrong. He just didn't know it was walking toward him from the direction he'd least expected, from the direction of the grave. She parked 3 blocks from the townhouse. Not in front of it, not in the adjacent garage. 3 blocks east, on a side street with good sight lines in both directions and a clear path back to the bridge if she needed to move fast. Old habit. 4 years in Verity had layered wilderness survival instinct over the urban pattern recognition she'd developed across 11 years of watching Damien operate, and the combination produced something she didn't have a clean name for, a kind of spatial awareness that never fully switched off, that processed exits and angles and visibility with the background persistence of a system that had learned once what it cost to stop paying attention. She sat in the car for 6 minutes. The townhouse was dark at the front except for the ground floor windows, which showed the warm yellow of interior lighting through curtains she recognized. She had chosen those curtains 7 years ago from a showroom on Madison Avenue, a detail so mundane and so specific that it produced a sensation she refused to call anything sentimental. She noted it, and she filed it, and she moved past it the way she moved past most things now, quickly and without ceremony. At 8:14 p.m., a town car pulled up to the front of the townhouse. Damien got out. She watched him from 3 blocks away through the compact binoculars she kept in the inside pocket of her coat. He was in a dark suit, no tie, the collar of his overcoat turned up against the April wind. He moved the way he'd always moved, with the unhurried weight of a man who expected space to be made for him, who had never in his adult life needed to hurry because the world around him had been arranged to accommodate his pace. He was heavier than the surveillance photograph. Not dramatically, but enough to read. The particular weight that accumulates in men who are under sustained pressure and eating and drinking to manage it. His hair had gone further into gray. The set of his shoulders was different, tighter. He went inside. The town car left. She gave it 12 minutes. Then she got out of her car and walked 1 block north and 2 blocks west and let herself in through the alley gate at the back of the property, using a key she'd had cut from a wax impression she'd lifted from Giselle's key ring when Giselle had set her bag on the coffee shop table between them 3 days ago and spent 40 seconds looking at the envelope. Giselle had not noticed. She had not been meant to. The back door was a service entrance that opened to the kitchen. Evelyn had designed the security system in this house 8 years ago, and she knew because she had checked through Otto's remote access 2 weeks prior that it had been updated once since then. A firmware upgrade on the panel, no structural changes. The bypass took 11 seconds. She was inside. The house smelled the same. That was the thing she hadn't prepared for. Not the layout, which she knew cold. Not the sounds of the building settling around her, which she remembered, but the smell. Wood polish and something that was neither food nor perfume, but the accumulated atmospheric residue of a specific domestic life. And it hit her with the particular violence of a sense memory she'd thought she had successfully buried, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for exactly 3 seconds letting it land, and then she walked past it. She heard voices from the study on the 2nd floor. 2 voices. Damien's, low, that distinctive unhurried baritone that could shift into something flat and very cold with almost no warning, and one she didn't immediately recognize. Male, younger, controlled but not comfortable. She took the back stairs. The door to the study was half open. She positioned herself in the hall shadow 6 feet from the frame, where the angle gave her a partial sight line into the room without putting her in any sight line from inside it. Damien was behind his desk. The man across from him was mid-30s, dark jacket, dark hair going early gray at the temples. He was sitting in the chair in front of the desk, and his posture was the posture of someone who had been asked to sit and was finding the experience uncomfortable. She recognized him after 4 seconds. Thomas Wren. She had put Thomas Wren on her list of 7. He was a financial intermediary, not the same tier as Marcus Healy, not as senior as Pruitt, but connected laterally to both of them and possessing, in his documented role within a real estate investment structure in New Jersey, a paper trail that linked 3 of Damien's port-adjacent companies to a common point of origin that was, by itself, close to the RICO thread she needed. She had not made contact with Wren. She had marked him as a potential approach in month 9, and then concluded, based on what she'd gathered about his temperament, that he was too invested in his own position to cooperate voluntarily. She'd moved him to the background and focused elsewhere. She was looking at him now in Damien's study, and she was processing something that had not fully resolved yet. Something about his posture, about the way he was sitting in that chair, that was wrong in a way she was still identifying. "The Trenton address," Damien said. She stopped breathing. The building on Chambers Street, Damien continued, and his voice was so level it was almost meditative. Studio apartment, third floor. Registered to a Claire Marsh. Wren shifted in the chair. I don't know what you're… Thomas. Damien set both hands flat on the desk. I've been very patient. You know I've been patient because you're still sitting in that chair instead of somewhere less comfortable. So I'm going to ask you one more time, clearly, so there's no misunderstanding between us. Who is Claire Marsh? A long silence. Evelyn's back was against the hallway wall. She was not moving. She was not breathing in any way that made sound. Every muscle in her body had gone to a particular kind of stillness that she'd learned in Verity from watching Rubin work. The stillness of a person in a space where movement is the danger, where the only viable posture is absolute quiet and the processing of information. He was processing very fast. Thomas Wren knew the Trenton address. Thomas Wren, whom she had never contacted. Thomas Wren, who was not on any list she'd shared with anyone. Thomas Wren, who had no mechanism through which he should have known that Claire Marsh existed, let alone where she lived. Which meant one of three things. Damien's people had found the apartment through independent surveillance, possible, but she'd been meticulous about her patterns. Wren had come to the Chambers Street address himself and identified it through some means she couldn't immediately account for, or someone who knew the address had told him. Only 5 people knew that address. Otto, Sylvie, the bookie-working Boyd Renna, and 2 others, a man named Cass, who was her logistics contact for the false identity documents, and a woman named Dara. Dara, the trauma nurse from Verity, who had left the community 14 months ago, returned to the outside world, and whom Evelyn had made contact with 6 months ago because Dara had skills she needed. Specifically, a medical background that had allowed her to access certain pharmaceutical records connected to one of Damien's money laundering structures through a hospital supply chain. She had trusted Dara because Dara had treated her frostbitten hands in a room in the wilderness and had said, with the flat directness of a competent person, "You'll adapt." And she had been right. She had trusted Dara because Dara had chosen Verity, and Verity had been the thing that rebuilt her, and you did not betray the place that rebuilt you. Except you did. People did. People did it for money, or fear, or survival, or the complicated calculation of someone who has returned to a world they left and found the world less patient with their principles than the wilderness had been. She came to see me, Wren said. The words came out of him with the specific quality of something that had been held in place for a while and had finally been permitted to fall. Not confession exactly, more like structural failure. The sound of a man who had been carrying something heavy and had run out of the particular muscle required. Who did? Damien said. The woman in Trenton, Claire Marsh. A pause. She called herself that, but the way she knew things, about the New Jersey structure, about how the accounts connected. She knew the specifics in a way that only someone who'd been inside it could know. Wren's voice had a tremor in it now. She wanted me to cooperate, to testify. She said there was an investigation, federal, that could… When was this? 6 weeks ago. The room was very quiet. 6 weeks, Damien said. I didn't know what to do. She had documentation. She showed me records I didn't know existed, records of transactions I'd been part of. Damien, things that could put me away for… His voice broke at the edge and he pulled it back. I panicked. I sat on it for 3 weeks, and then I came to you. 3 weeks, Damien said. I know. You sat on it for 3 weeks. I know. Wren's voice had gone to the flat register of a man who knows he has no defense and has stopped pretending otherwise. I'm sorry. Damien was still for a moment. Then he stood, which was somehow worse than anything else he could have done. Because Damien standing from behind that desk and coming around to the front of it was a thing Evelyn had seen 11 times in their marriage. The precise number she'd counted because she'd learned early what it meant. And it meant that whatever patience he'd been exercising had reached its conclusion. Who is she? Damien said. He was standing in front of the desk now, hands at his sides, voice very quiet. Wren shook his head. I don't know. I tried to find out. I hired someone. I had the Chambers Street building checked. The name is false. Everything is false. There's no record anywhere of a Claire Marsh that matches the woman I met. She knew too much, Damien. She knew things that… What did she look like? A pause. Blonde. short hair, 40, maybe 45. Her eyes were… Ren stopped. Damien had gone very still. Not the controlled stillness of a careful man. A different kind. The kind that precedes something. Her eyes, Damien said. Light, blue-green. She was… Ren seemed to register the change in Damien's quality of stillness and faltered. What? What is it? Damien didn't answer immediately. He turned and walked to the window and stood there. The same posture she'd watched through the resort glass 4 years ago, both hands pressed flat against the frame, looking out at something that wasn't the view. From her position in the hallway, Evelyn could see his profile. She watched his face change. It did not change dramatically. Damien Viscari was not a dramatic man. He was a man of suppressions and controlled surfaces, and the change that moved through his face in those next several seconds was not an explosion, but an implosion, a sequence of small internal collapses that registered on his features the way a building registers the failure of its load-bearing structures. First a slight compression, then a stillness so complete. It looked almost peaceful, and then, underneath it, something that she recognized because she had been married to it for 11 years and had learned to identify it the way you learn to identify the sound a car engine makes right before it seizes. Damien Viscari was afraid, not the managed paranoia she'd been feeding for months, not the professional wariness of a crime boss who has learned to distrust his environment. Genuine, primal fear, the kind that comes from understanding something that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. Get out, he said. Ren blinked. Damien, get out of my house. Still quiet, still facing the window. And do not speak about this to anyone, not a lawyer, not a friend, not your wife, not anyone. Do you understand me? It was not a question. Ren stood up. He gathered himself, the specific gathering of a man leaving a room that he never wants to be in again, and he walked out of the study. He walked past the hallway where Evelyn was standing in the shadow. I was 4 feet from her. She did not move. She barely existed. She was shadow and stillness and the particular suspension of a person who has learned that the most dangerous moment is the one right before you're discovered, and the only viable response to it is to become, as completely as possible, nothing. Ren walked past. He went down the stairs. She heard the front door open and close. She looked back through the half-open study door at Damien, who was still at the window. He hadn't moved. She should have left then. She knew it. Every operational instinct she'd developed over 4 years told her clearly and without equivocation, the address is burned, the Trenton apartment is burned, the Claire Marsh identity is burned. Leave now. Get back to the car. Adapt and move and salvage what can be salvaged from a secondary position. She knew all of that. She stepped into the doorway. Hello, Damien. He turned. The look on his face when he saw her was the most honest thing she'd seen from him in the last decade of their marriage. And it was terrible. Not in a way she could feel satisfaction about, not clean enough for that, but terrible in the specific way of a thing that is both exactly what you prepared for and nothing like what you expected. Because you can model a moment intellectually for 4 years and still find, when it arrives, that the reality of it has a weight and texture that no model can account for. He looked at her. She stood in the doorway of a study that she had furnished, in a house that she had run, wearing the face she'd been born with and the expression she'd spent 4 years building, and she let him look. You're alive, he said. I've been alive for a while. His voice, when it came again, was not what she expected. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the cold flatness that preceded his most dangerous moments. It was something quieter and stranger, the voice of a man encountering something that has exceeded the categories his mind has available for processing it. How long? He said. 4 years. She stepped into the room. I came out of the forest the night you decided not to come in. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, watched him run the arithmetic of it, the implications stacking and cascading behind his eyes, in a way she could read because she had spent 11 years learning to read him, and had spent 4 additional years reading him from a distance, and knew the particular expression of a man whose understanding of his own history is being revised in real time. The operations, he said. Yes. Caruso. The Connecticut firm. The storage facility. That was mine. Each confirmation landed like something being placed on a scale, and she watched the scale tip incrementally, and she watched him process the full weight of what he was being asked to hold. Not that he had an enemy. He'd always had enemies, but that his enemy was her, had been her, the woman he'd written off and declared dead and replaced with such efficient practicality, that the sustained, precise, 4-year erosion of everything he'd built had been authored by the person he'd been most certain he never needed to fear. "Giselle," he said. "Giselle told me nothing you didn't already lose. I've had sources inside your organization for 2 years, Damien. She was a contingency, not a cornerstone." He took one step toward her and stopped. She didn't move. She was aware of the distance between them. 12 feet, 2 pieces of furniture between, the desk to her left and an armchair to her right. And she was aware of the exits, and she was aware of where his hands were, and she was at the same time aware of something else. This was not the moment she had planned for. She was in this room not because the plan had executed, but because the plan had been compromised. And the difference between those two things was the difference between standing on solid ground and standing on ice that she had not had time to test. "What do you want?" he said. "What I've always wanted. What you took from me when you left me in that forest." She held his gaze. "Not revenge, Damien. I want you to understand that because it matters. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to finish what I started, and what I started was a legal case that will take everything you've built and transfer it to the people your organization has spent 30 years victimizing." "A legal case," he said. Flat, like the words were in a language he was translating with some difficulty. "Federal, financial fraud, racketeering, organized crime. The RICO designation specifically." She paused. "I'm missing one component. That's why I came here tonight instead of waiting, because someone burned my timeline." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Part of it was the fear she'd identified at the window, which had not left but had been organized now, managed, brought under the control of a man who had spent his life managing dangerous things. Part of it was something she hadn't expected and didn't immediately have a name for. Then his phone rang. He looked at it on the desk. He looked at her. He picked it up. "Not now," he said into it. A pause. She watched his face. Something changed in it. "Say that again," he said. She watched him listen. She watched the managed fear reorganize itself into something operational. The shift from the man at the window to the crime boss who had run a 30-year empire. The shift she'd seen him make a dozen times in their marriage. The way he could move from one register to another with a speed that had always been, she admitted, something she recognized as genuine capability, even when everything else about him was something she had to work to respect. He ended the call. He looked at her. "The woman who gave you my address in Trenton," he said. "What was her name?" Evelyn's chest went cold. "Why?" she said. "Her name." She didn't answer immediately. She was running through it. The call, his face during the call, the shift, the specific quality of what he was looking at her with now, which was not the fear from a moment ago and was not the calculation of a man planning his next move, but was something that looked with a precision that frightened her, like pity. "Dara," she said. "Dara Ellison." The way he said it, the full name, certain, immediate, told her before anything else he said. "She's been working for me," Damien said, "for 7 months." The room didn't move. Nothing moved. The furniture and the walls and the curtains she had chosen on a Tuesday afternoon on Madison Avenue, and the desk and the lamp and the floor under her feet, none of it moved, but something inside the arrangement of the last 4 years shifted with the particular finality of a foundation giving way, silent and total, and without any recourse. 7 months. Dara had come to her 8 months ago. She had brought herself, offered herself, with the specific credentials of someone Evelyn trusted at the deepest possible level, the level of shared survival, the level of the community that had rebuilt her, the level of a woman who had treated her hands in the cold and told her she'd adapt and been right. 7 months, which meant within 4 weeks of Evelyn making contact with her, Dara had been turned. "The RICO evidence," Damien said. His voice was almost gentle now, which was somehow worse than anything else. "The testimony. Everything you were building through the parallel investigation." He paused. "She gave me the structure of it 6 months ago, Evelyn. I've spent 6 months not moving on it because I wanted to understand the full scope. I wanted to see all of it before I closed it." He had let her keep building. He had watched her add the final pieces. The port terminal connection, the bribery documentation, the conversations with Sylvie, the federal contact. And he had let her continue because a partial operation closed too early leaves remnants, and Damien Viscari had never believed in leaving remnants. He'd been waiting for her to finish. Prove, she said. The word came out with almost nothing on it. Is fine. Uncomfortable, but fine. He'll be returned in the morning. A pause. I'm not a murderer, Evelyn. You left me to die in a forest. The words hit the room like something physical. He didn't flinch. He held her gaze, and in his face was the complicated arithmetic of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for 4 years and has never once set it down. And she could see that he hadn't. She could see, with the particular vision of someone who has spent 4 years building a clear picture of her enemy, that whatever else Damien Viscari had or hadn't felt about that night at Ashford Pines, he had not been unaffected by it, which did not matter, which changed nothing, which was information she noted and filed and did not allow to mean anything that it wasn't entitled to mean. What happens now? She said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, and the pride was a small, cold thing, the only pride currently available to her. That depends, he said, on you. She looked at him. I have the structure of your case, he said. Sylvie Okafor, the federal contact, the sources inside my organization. I know most of them. I can close this in 48 hours. Your 4 years of work, gone. The investigation, dead. Every person you put at risk to build this, exposed. He paused. Or, she waited. You walk away, tonight. You walk out of this house, you go somewhere I can't find you, and we are finished. The case disappears. My people stand down. You get your life back. Whatever life you can build from whatever you have left. He spread his hands slightly. I don't want you dead, Evelyn. I want this to be over. She looked at him for a long moment. She had spent 4 years imagining this confrontation. In the version she had imagined, she was the one holding the position of power, the one with the complete architecture, the sealed case, the aligned allies, the moment of revelation designed to land with maximum effect. She had imagined speaking from a position where every variable was controlled and every outcome was mapped. She was standing instead in a room where the ground had been pulled out from under everything she'd built, with a man who had known she was coming for 6 months, having arrived here not at the end of a plan but in the middle of its collapse. She thought about Cassandra's voice on a cold morning. Don't become him. She thought about what she had in reserve, what had not been compromised, what Dara knew and didn't know, the specific compartmentalization she'd maintained, the things she'd kept separate even from the people she'd most trusted, the information she'd held back not out of distrust, but out of the survival instinct of someone who had learned once what total exposure cost. She thought about the envelope she'd given Giselle. Damien didn't know about the envelope. She was certain of this, with the precision of someone running an inventory at speed, because the envelope had been created and transferred in a window that preceded Dara's involvement by 2 months, and the envelope's contents were known only to Sylvie, who had not been in contact with Dara and whose operation ran through a channel that Dara had no visibility into. One thread, still intact, still moving. She was in the worst position she'd been in since the night she'd crossed a frozen creek in the dark, with half her fingers dying. She had survived that. She looked at Damien Viscari, at the face of the man who had stood at a window with a glass of scotch, while the cold tried to kill her. And she understood with a sudden and total clarity that there was no version of the next 48 hours in which she accepted his offer. Not because she was reckless, not because she had lost perspective, but because walking away was not surviving. Walking away was just a slower kind of disappearing. She had done that once already. She was not going to do it again. No, she said. He looked at her. I'm not walking away, she said. And you're not going to close the investigation because if you move on Sylvie Okafor or the federal infrastructure, everything I have goes to every crime family on the eastern seaboard simultaneously. Not to law enforcement, to your peers, Damien. Everyone who fears you because they believe you are controlled and strategic. Everything that proves you left your wife to die in a snowstorm because you didn't want the inconvenience of a divorce. She held his gaze without blinking. You know what happens to a man in your position when that story gets out? It's not a legal problem, it's a credibility problem. And in your world, credibility is the only thing keeping you alive. The room was very still. You're bluffing, he said. Try me, she said. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. Outside the townhouse window, Manhattan moved with its vast and indifferent noise. Somewhere in the city, Leon Pruitt was in a room without windows. Somewhere in Philadelphia, Sylvie Okafor was waiting for a call that wasn't coming. Somewhere in a studio apartment in Trenton, walls covered in color-coded thread mapped the architecture of a plan that was now partially dismantled and partially intact and entirely dependent on what happened in the next 60 seconds in a study in the East 70s. Damien Viscari set his phone down on the desk. He did not pick it up again. He did not call anyone. He stood in his study and he looked at his wife, the wife he had left in the snow, the wife who had come back from it with short hair and seawater eyes and 4 years of calculated, patient total war. And he said nothing for a long time. And in the silence of his saying nothing, Evelyn Cross understood two things simultaneously. The first, he believed her. The second, it didn't matter. Because behind him, through the window, she could see the dark shape of a car that had not been there when she'd arrived. Parked on the cross street, engine off, no lights. A second car, 30 feet behind it. She recognized the pattern. She had spent 4 years learning his patterns. "You called them," she said, "before you picked up the phone." He said nothing. "The call was a signal," she said. "You already knew about Trenton. You knew I was coming here tonight. Wren wasn't here by accident." She stopped. The cold was spreading through her chest again. Not the cold of the forest, not the cold of physical danger, but the colder cold of a mind encountering the full shape of something it has failed to see until it is too late. "You set the table," she said. "You let Wren tell you in front of me. You wanted me to hear it. You wanted me standing in this room, right now, believing I had one card left." He looked at her. "The men outside," he said quietly, "are not here to hurt you. They're here to make sure you don't leave before we finish this conversation." She looked at the window. She looked at the door. She looked at the man across the desk from her who had spent 30 years being very good at exactly this, at creating the conditions in which the other person made the move he'd already prepared for. She had walked into it. She had told herself she was coming here because she had no choice, and she had been right about that, and she had been wrong about everything else. And the difference between those two truths was the difference between a woman who survives what comes next and a woman who doesn't. She had 60 seconds, maybe fewer. One intact thread, one envelope, in a bag, on the east side of the city. She needed Giselle Marceau to open it before the men outside came through the door. She had no way to tell her, unless... She looked at Damien. She looked at his phone on the desk. And she did the only thing left that he hadn't planned for, the only move available to a person who has nothing left but the one variable the other side doesn't know about, the move that required her to be, for the first time in 4 years, not the strategist who never showed her hand, but the woman who had walked into a frozen forest with nothing and come out the other side of it. She picked up his phone off the desk. He moved toward her. She dialed. She dialed Sylvie. Not Giselle, Sylvie. Because Sylvie was the instruction inside the envelope, Sylvie was the one who would know what the envelope meant and what to do the moment it was opened. And what Evelyn needed right now was not the message delivered, but the mechanism activated. And the mechanism was Sylvie Okafor picking up her phone in Philadelphia and making one specific call that would set the final sequence moving whether Evelyn was free or not. Damien crossed the desk in 2 steps. He was fast. She'd forgotten how fast he could move when he decided to, the particular speed of a large man who almost never needed to hurry and so retained the capacity as something unexercised and therefore unexpected. His hand came down on her wrist before the call connected, and the grip was hard, the kind of grip that communicated without any ambiguity that he was not interested in negotiation at this specific moment. She did not let go of the phone. She heard it connect. 1 ring, 2. "Let it go," Damien said. His voice was very quiet. His grip tightened. 3 rings. She looked at him directly. She did not struggle. Struggling was a waste of energy she didn't have. But she held the phone and she held his gaze and she let the rings count, because every ring was a second and every second was a variable, and variables were all she had. "Evelyn." Harder, the bones of her wrist compressing. "Let go of the phone." Sylvie picked up. "It's time," Evelyn said. 2 words. Her voice was flat and clear and completely controlled, and she had prepared those 2 words for this specific contingency 6 months ago, and they were enough. Damien took the phone. He looked at the screen. He looked at the name, Sylvie Okafor, listed plainly, no alias, because the phone was his and she had dialed from his contacts, and Sylvie Okafor was not in his contacts, which meant the number had come from her memory, which meant he was looking at a name he didn't yet have a face for. He ended the call. He looked at her. "Who is Sylvie Okafor?" he said. She said nothing. He set the phone down. He stepped back from her, not releasing the situation, just repositioning, the way a man does when he's deciding whether to use a door or go through the wall. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen once before, at the window of the resort, the expression of a man calculating the cost of a choice he hadn't fully made yet. Then the front door of the townhouse opened, not broken open, opened with a key, which was worse, because it meant someone who had a key, which meant one of Damien's men with a copy, or it meant the building's security had been bypassed in a way that Damien's perimeter hadn't flagged, and the fact that it hadn't flagged meant something about the men in the cars outside that she hadn't accounted for. Two men came up the stairs. She recognized the first by his build, wide through the shoulders, short neck, the specific density of a man who had spent 30 years in physical enforcement work and whose body had organized itself around that function. His name was Reese. She knew him from 11 years of peripheral observation. He had been with Damien since before she came into the picture and had always treated her with the particular impersonal courtesy of a man who regarded his employer's domestic life as a zone of professional indifference. He did not look at her with indifference now. He looked at her the way people look at something they believed was dead. "Mr. Vescari." His voice was careful. "The vehicles on the south side have been repositioned." "By whom?" Damien said. "Unknown. They moved out on their own, sir. The drivers, we can't reach either of them." Damien's jaw tightened, a small movement, almost invisible. The second man stayed near the door. Evelyn registered him without looking directly at him. Young, compact, her peripheral system tagging him as unknown. Not a face she had in her mental inventory of Damien's current personnel. New hire. Which meant loyalty untested by time, which meant a variable. She filed all of this in the 3 seconds it took Reese to finish speaking. "Search the perimeter," Damien said. "All of it. I want confirmation on every exit point." Reese left. The young man stayed. Damien turned back to Evelyn. "Sylvie Okafor," he said again. "You can keep asking," she said. "The answer doesn't change." "It will." Not a threat. A statement. The flat confidence of a man who has been in this position before and knows how these conversations end. "Everything ends, Evelyn. You know that. You've known me long enough to know that." "I also know," she said, "that you have approximately 30 minutes before what I just started becomes irreversible." He looked at her. "2 words," she said. "That's all I said. That's all it needed." She watched him calculate. She watched him run the architecture of it. What 2 words to an unknown woman in Philadelphia could activate. What was already in motion. What the moved vehicles on the south side meant in that context. She watched him arrive at the edge of something and decide, for the first time since she'd walked into the study, that he was not fully in control of the geometry of this. "Sit down," he said. "No." He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down himself, behind the desk, which was its own kind of message. He was settling in. He was prepared to wait. He did not believe 30 minutes was the real number. She needed him to stay settled. She needed him in that chair and thinking about Sylvie Okafor while the rest of it moved. "What happened to you?" he said. She blinked. Of all the things she'd expected him to say. "In the forest," he said. His voice had changed register. Not to softness, because Damien Vescari did not do softness, but to something lower, something that sat closer to the real thing underneath all the surface architecture. "I want to know what happened." "You want to stall," she said. "Maybe both." She looked at him. She was not going to tell him. She had decided, years ago, in a very specific moment, in a cabin in Verity, with Reuben Marsh's gray dog asleep on the floor and the sound of the wind working against the walls, that she was never going to give Damien Vescari the story of how she survived. Not because of sentiment, because the story of how she survived was hers. It was the one thing he hadn't been able to take when he left her in the snow, and she was not going to hand it back to him in his own study. "It doesn't matter what happened," she said. "What matters is that I'm here. In my house. In your house. Yes, with two of my men between you and the door. One, she said. Reese left. The young man by the door shifted his weight. Damien looked at him. Cole. Cole straightened. Stay with her, Damien said. He stood. He picked up his own phone, not the one she'd used, a second one from the desk drawer that she hadn't known about, and which told her, with the clean efficiency of a fact landing in an already overloaded system, that there were still things about this house and this man that 4 years of external observation had not captured. He walked toward the door. Where are you going? She said. To make a call. To whom? He stopped at the door. He looked back at her. In the lamplight of the study, with the curtains she'd chosen behind him and the books on the shelves she'd never read, because they were decorative and they'd both known they were decorative, he looked like a man she had once, in a very different life, tried to understand. The people you think are your allies inside my organization, he said. I'm going to have a conversation with them about what their cooperation with you is worth to me versus what it costs them. She said nothing. I'm not going to hurt them, he said. I'm going to offer them a better arrangement, which is what I should have done 6 months ago when Dara gave me the list. He paused. Your inside sources, Evelyn. They made a choice. Tonight they get to make a different one. He walked out. Cole stood by the door. Evelyn stood in the center of the study and looked at the window and did the arithmetic. Sylvie had the call. 2 words, and Sylvie knew exactly what they meant. The contingency they'd built 9 months ago. The protocol for the scenario in which Evelyn was compromised or contained. Sylvie would call Giselle. Giselle would open the envelope. The envelope contained 3 things: a thumb drive, a list of 12 names, and a single typed instruction that read, "These people are expecting your call. Tell them the time is now. They will know what to do." The 12 names were not sources inside Damien's organization. They were the heads, deputies, and senior representatives of the 4 crime families on the eastern seaboard that existed in a state of managed rivalry with Damien's operation. The people who feared him not because they loved him, but because he had maintained for 30 years the appearance of an organization too disciplined and too controlled to touch. The people who would, if given sufficient evidence that his control was illusory, move on the vacuum his collapse would create. The thumb drive contained the evidence, not the federal case, the other evidence. The evidence Evelyn had kept completely separate from everything Dara had access to, the documentation she'd assembled through Otto in the final 8 months. The material that did not need a federal RICO designation to be devastating because it was not designed for a court. It was designed for an audience of people who understood exactly what they were looking at and had been waiting, collectively, for 30 years for an opening. She had not built a legal trap only. She had built 2 traps. Damien had found one of them. Cole was watching her with the careful attention of a young man who had been told to watch her and was taking the instructions seriously. He was standing 6 feet from the door. He had a phone in his left hand and something under his right arm that she could identify by the cut of his jacket. She looked at him. How long have you been with him? She said. Cole said nothing. 14 months, she said. Give or take. You have the look of someone who came in with the Chicago hire, the new security firm. She watched his face. Small confirmation. A very slight tightening around the eyes. You don't know me. You know that Damien Viscari's wife was declared dead 5 years ago, and that the woman standing in this study is something that's interrupted your evening significantly. She paused. What did he tell you about me? Nothing, Cole said. His voice was younger than his face. Then you don't know what this is, she said. You're standing in a room guarding a woman you have no brief on, for a man who didn't brief you, in a situation that is changing faster than he's told you. She kept her voice level. No performance. Just facts. Delivered the way Reuben Marsh delivered facts about the weather. Plainly. Because the weather didn't care about your feelings, and neither did the facts. In 30 minutes, the nature of your employment changes. Not because of me. Because of what's already in motion. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to let me go. I'm asking you to think about who you're doing this for and whether that person is going to be in a position to honor any arrangement he's made with you. Cole looked at her. He did not move, but he looked at her differently than he had 30 seconds ago, and that was enough for now. The call Damien made took 11 minutes. She knew this because she counted, standing in the study with Cole's eyes on her. and the window dark behind her and the sound of the city outside doing nothing to acknowledge that anything of significance was happening on the second floor of a townhouse on East 73rd Street. When Damien came back, his face had changed, not dramatically. A contraction, the specific compression of a man who has received information that has required him to revise something he believed was settled. "Sit down," he said again. "I told you. Evelyn." He said her name the way he hadn't said it in years. Not as a door closing, but as something else. Something she couldn't immediately identify because it had been so long since she'd heard it from him, and the version she'd been carrying in her head for 4 years was a flatter, more functional thing than what was in the room right now. "Sit down, please." She sat. Not because he'd asked, because sitting was information. It told her what the next 2 minutes looked like from a positional standpoint, and she needed that clarity. He sat across from her, not behind the desk. In the armchair, which put them at the same level, which was a choice she noted. "3 of the sources," he said. "The ones I called." He stopped, looked at his hands. "They didn't take the arrangement." She waited. "They told me—" He stopped again. This was unusual. Damien Viscari did not stop in the middle of sentences from uncertainty. He stopped from calculation. This was not calculation. "They told me what Dara brought me was incomplete, that there were pieces she didn't have access to, that the case already filed, the federal components. They're not the primary instrument." He looked up at her. "Who is the primary instrument?" he said. She held his gaze. "The envelope," she said, "is already open." She watched it land. She watched him understand, not partially, not with the buffering delay of a man who needed time to process, but immediately and completely, because Damien Viscari had not run a 30-year criminal empire by being slow, and the moment the words left her mouth, his mind ran the implications to their end, and she could see him arrive there. The families. "You didn't just build a legal case," he said. "No. You built a—" He stopped. He looked at her with something she had not seen on his face in 11 years of marriage and 4 years of war. Genuine, unmanaged, unperformed respect. "You went to the families. I went to the people who have been waiting for evidence that you're vulnerable, that your organization is not what you've spent 30 years telling them it is." She kept her voice even. "The federal case puts you in prison. What I sent tonight ends your organization as a functioning entity within 72 hours. Because the moment those families understand the full picture, they move on every asset, every territory, every arrangement you have. Not because I asked them to. Because it's the rational response to an opening they've been waiting for." He stood up. Not aggressively. He stood up the way a man stands when the room has become too small for what he's thinking, and he walked to the window and he stood at it, hands at his sides this time, not pressed against the glass. Just standing, looking at the street. "How long?" he said. "How long before they move?" "Some of them already have," she said. "The documentation went out with the call. They've had 40 minutes. He turned from the window. His face was doing something she'd never seen it do. Not collapsing, not fragmenting, but reorganizing. The 30-year architecture of a man who had always known where he stood, reassembling itself around a new understanding of the ground. Cole was still by the door. Cole was also, Evelyn noted, no longer watching her. He was watching Damien. Damien noticed this too. "Cole," he said. "Sir." A pause. Damien looked at him for a moment. Something passed between them that Evelyn couldn't fully read. The specific communication of a man with 30 years of practice at assessing loyalty and the specific response of a younger man who has been asked, in that look, a question he's been quietly working out the answer to for the past 15 minutes. "Get out," Damien said. Cole left. Just the two of them. The city outside the window, the lamp on the desk, the curtain she'd chosen. The silence of a house that had been a crime boss's home and a wife's prison, and was now something neither of them had a clean category for. "What do you want?" Damien said. "I told you already." "You told me you wanted the case to stand. That's not all of it." He walked back toward her. Not threatening, just closing the distance, the way people close distance when they're talking about something real. "What do you actually want? From me? Tonight? In this room?" She looked at him. The answer she'd had for 4 years was the answer she'd given him. The empire gone, the case filed, the evidence delivered, justice through legal mechanism rather than violence. That was still true. That was still the answer. But he was asking something more specific. I want you to know, she said, that I was there, in that forest, for 2 hours, in the dark, in negative 15 degrees, with my coat gone and my hands dying, and I was calling Damien. I was calling loud enough that if you'd opened that back door, just opened it and listened, you would have heard me. He said nothing. I want you to know that, she said, not so you feel something about it. I'm past caring what you feel. But I was there, and you were inside, and that is what happened. I want that to be said out loud, in a room, between us, where you can't revise it, or manage it, or file it somewhere you don't have to look at it. He held her gaze. He did not look away. I heard you, he said. The silence that followed was not empty. I heard you, he said again. That night. I was at the window. I heard something. I told myself it was the wind. He stopped. I told myself it was the wind, and then I poured a drink, and then I went to room 14. The lamp, the curtains, the desk, the city. She breathed. In through the nose, out, slow. The way Cassandra had taught her in the first winter at Verity. Not because breathing was the solution to anything, but because it was the difference between a decision made from the body's panic and a decision made from the mind's clarity. And tonight had been full of decisions that needed to be the second kind. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. Her phone. Not Damien's. The one she'd kept, the backup. The one that had a signal because she'd checked before she left the car. She looked at the screen. Sylvie. It's moving. All 12. Giselle made the calls. Damien's operations director just contacted our federal channel independently. She read the message twice. His operations director. The man who ran the day-to-day logistics of Damien's empire. Not Reese, not the financial people, but the man who coordinated the operational tier, who had direct knowledge of the port arrangements, the bribery payments, the 3 decades of organized crime activity at the scale and specificity required for the RICO designation. His name was Bernard Culp, and he had been with Damien for 22 years, and he had not been on Evelyn's list because she had assessed him as the single most loyal person in Damien's orbit and had never allocated resources toward turning him. He had contacted the federal channel independently, which meant Damien's own people were reading the direction of the wind and making decisions, and the decisions they were making were not in the direction of their employer. She looked up at Damien. He had not seen the message. He was standing 6 feet away, looking at the window again, and his posture had changed in the past 3 minutes, in a way she recognized because she'd seen it once before. Not on Damien, but on herself. In a cabin in Verity, in the 2nd month, when the frostbite had finally fully healed, and she'd stood in front of the small mirror above the basin and understood, completely and without further negotiation, that the life she'd had before the forest was not a life she was going back to. The posture of a person who has arrived at the end of something and knows it. Damien, she said. He turned. Culp just contacted the federal investigation independently. She kept her voice flat. Not cruel, just clear. It's not just the families. Your own people are moving. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. She waited for the rage, the flat, cold rage she'd seen him deploy across 11 years of marriage, the register that preceded his most dangerous moments. She braced for it the way she'd learned to brace, with the specific internal posture of a person who has been in proximity to that particular weather system enough times to know when it's building. It didn't come. What came instead was worse, in its way. Not worse for her safety, but worse in the specific sense of being more honest and more irrevocable than rage would have been. What came was the absence of it, the place where rage would have been, empty. A man on the other side of his own empire's end, standing in a room with the woman he'd written off, and finding that the machinery of his response, the 30-year machinery of threat and control and managed violence, had nothing left to run on. How many of them? He said. Enough, she said. Culp. He stopped, started again. Culp has been with me since 22 years, she said. I know. Then you know what it means that he... Yes, she said. I know exactly what it means. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere below, she heard a car on the street, then another, then the sound of a radio. Not music, something with voices, the clipped cadence of professional communication. She looked at the window. Damien looked at the window. 3 cars had stopped on the block. not the dark sedans of crime family representatives. Marked vehicles. One of them with lights running but no siren. The specific configuration of a federal approach designed to announce presence without triggering panic. Bernard Culp had not just made contact, he had provided timing and location. Damien looked at the street for a long moment. 3 seconds. 5. Then he looked at her. "The case," he said. "The evidence you built. Is it complete?" She didn't answer immediately. "Is it complete?" he said again. "If I walked out of this house right now and got in a car and drove to wherever you want me to go, is what you have enough to put me away for the rest of what I have left?" "Yes," she said. No gaps, no reasonable doubt. Culp just closed the last gap. He nodded. One small nod. The nod of a man receiving a confirmation he already knew was coming and has decided to receive with whatever dignity the situation still permits. He picked up his jacket from the back of the desk chair. He put it on. He straightened the collar. The old habit, the specific vanity of a man who had always cared about how he appeared in the moments that mattered, and she noted this with the complicated vision of someone who had hated and studied and survived the person in front of her and could not entirely separate those three things. "I want one thing," he said. She waited. "I want the families to know it was you," he said. "Not the feds, not Culp, you. I want the record. Whatever record there is, criminal, legal, whatever survives. I want it clear that Damien Vescari was not brought down by a government investigation or by disloyalty inside his ranks." He looked at her directly. "I want it clear that it was you, the woman I left in the snow." She looked at him for a long moment. She understood what he was asking. It was not contrition. Damien Vescari did not do contrition. It was the last form of control available to him. The narrative of his own ending, the authorship of the story of his defeat, the choice to have been beaten by something specific rather than by the accumulated weight of his own mistakes. She thought about saying no. She thought about Cassandra's voice, about what Cassandra had meant, and what she'd promised, and what the past 4 years had cost, and what she'd said, standing in the cold, when Cassandra had named the line she was asking her not to cross. "I don't intend to kill him. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant." She looked at Damien Vescari, the man who had stood at a window while she called his name in the dark, and she said, "The record will be clear." He walked past her. He walked to the study door. He stopped. "Evelyn," he said. She did not turn. "I heard you," he said. "That night. I want you to know I heard you." The door opened, his footsteps on the stairs. The front door of the townhouse, opening. Below, on East 73rd Street, the sound of a city that was still moving, still indifferent, still doing what cities do. And in the middle of it, the sound of Damien Vescari walking out of his own house toward the lights of vehicles that were waiting for him, and the sound of voices, professional and calm, and the specific silence that follows a long thing ending. Evelyn Cross stood in the study alone. She looked at the window. She breathed. The lamp on the desk threw warm light across the room, across the curtains she'd chosen, and the books she'd never read, across the empty chair behind the desk, and the armchair where she'd sat, and the floor where 30 years of organized crime had just reached its conclusion in the quiet conversation between two people who had once shared a life and had spent the last 4 years on opposite sides of a war. Her phone buzzed again. "Sylvie. Federal team. He's cooperating. Culp is with the agents now. It's done." She read it. She looked at the window. She looked at the city. It was not over. Not entirely. The paperwork would take months. The trials longer. The legal dissolution of Vescari Holdings and its subsidiaries, a process measured in years of filings and hearings and motions and counter-motions. Leon Pruitt would need to be found and released and supported. The 3 inside sources whose cooperation Damien had tried and failed to flip would need to be protected through the federal process. Sylvie had months of work ahead of her. Evelyn had months of testimony to prepare. But the active architecture of it, the 4-year construction of leverage and documentation and precisely positioned alliance, that was done. She had not killed anyone. She had not become him. She had built a machine out of patience and precision and the specific compressed strength of a person who had been taken to the edge of survival and had come back from it with a very clear understanding of what mattered and what didn't. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out the backup phone. She scrolled to a number she hadn't dialed in 4 months. It rang twice. "It's me," she said. Cassandra Holmes' voice came through the line, clear, direct, unhurried, the voice of a woman in a cabin in the wilderness who had been, for 30 years, right about exactly the things she'd been right about. "Is it done?" Cassandra said. "Almost," Evelyn said. A pause. "Are you whole?" Cassandra said. Evelyn looked at the window, at the street below, at the place where the cars had been and were no longer, where the lights had been and were no longer, where Damien Viscari had stood on these steps that morning, in the surveillance photograph she'd looked at 100 times and was no longer. "Ask me tomorrow," she said. She put the phone in her pocket. She walked out of the study, down the stairs, through the kitchen she'd cooked in for 8 years, out the back door and into the April air, which was cold and clean and carrying the specific smell of the city after rain, concrete and exhaust, and something green from the park 2 blocks over. And she stood in the alley behind the townhouse and looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings. No stars. Too much city light for stars. That was all right. She knew they were there. She walked toward her car. Behind her, the townhouse sat quiet on East 73rd Street, lights burning in the study window, empty now of everything except the furniture and the books and the lamp and the 30-year weight of a criminal empire that had just met the one enemy it was never going to be able to manage, contain, or buy. She turned the corner. She did not look back. The first snow of the following November came early. Evelyn was in a building on the west side of Philadelphia when it started, a renovated warehouse that smelled of new drywall and old timber and the particular freshness of a space that has been cleaned of something and is still adjusting to its own emptiness. She was standing at a second-floor window with a coffee cup going cold in her hand, watching the flakes come down over the parking lot below, and she was thinking about nothing specific, which was itself specific, because for 4 years thinking about nothing specific had been a luxury she could not afford. She could afford it now. The building had been purchased 3 months ago through a nonprofit structure that Sylvie Okafor had helped establish, funded by the first tranche of asset recovery from the Viscari Holdings dissolution, a legal process that had moved, given the scale of Bernard Culp's cooperation and the completeness of the evidence package, with unusual efficiency through the federal courts. The building had 12 rooms on the upper floor and a common space on the ground floor, and a kitchen that needed work, and a parking lot in the back, and an address that was not listed anywhere online yet, because the program it would house was 3 weeks from its official opening, and there were still boxes in the hallway and paint drying on the walls of room 7. The program did not have a formal name yet. Evelyn had been resisting the pressure to name it, which came from the nonprofit's communications coordinator, a young woman named Priya who had opinions about branding and was not wrong about the need for one but was going to have to wait, because Evelyn had learned, over the past year, that she was not good at naming things until she understood what they were, and she was still understanding what this was. What it was, in its operational form, was a residential support program for survivors of coercive control, people who had been inside systems designed to keep them dependent, isolated, and convinced that the system was the only thing keeping them safe. The population she was building toward was specific, people who had been embedded in environments, domestic or organizational or both, where the standard support infrastructure, shelters, hotlines, legal aid, had been insufficient because the threat architecture around them was sophisticated enough to adapt to those responses. People, in other words, who needed something more strategic than sympathy. She had been, for this past 6 months, the primary architect of both the program model and the physical space, working alongside Sylvie and a small team of consultants she'd identified through the network she'd built during the previous 4 years. Some of those consultants had never known who she was. They knew her now. She had also been, for 6 months, testifying. The federal trial was not a single event. It was a sequence. Hearings, depositions, grand jury appearances, the slow institutional machinery of a prosecution that touched 3 federal districts and involved 16 named defendants in the initial indictment, of which Damien Viscari was the primary but not the only. Evelyn had testified 7 times across 6 months. The first time was the hardest, not because of the content, but because of the room, the specific fluorescent neutrality of a federal proceeding, the lawyers and their careful language, the stenographer and her mechanical patience, and in the middle of it, the experience of being asked, repeatedly, by people with legal authority, to reconstruct events that she had spent 4 years processing in private. She had done it. She had done it plainly, completely, without performance and without evasion, with the same directness she'd used in Sylvie's office 11 months ago when she'd set a thumb drive on a desk and told a stranger she was a wife. The 7th time she testified, Damien was in the room. Not at the table, he was in the room behind the dividing rail, seated between 2 attorneys, in a dark suit with no tie. He had lost more weight. The gray in his hair had finished taking over. He sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him, in the particular posture of a man who has been instructed to remain still, and has decided that remaining still is the last form of dignity currently available to him. She did not look at him when she took her seat. She looked at the prosecutor, a woman named Dana Fitch, mid-40s, precise and unhurried in the way that effective prosecutors learn to be. And she answered Dana's questions with the same clarity she'd maintained across 6 sessions and 6 months of legal process. Dana walked her through the Ashford Pines resort. She described the storm. She described the room. She described walking out the back door at 9:47 p.m. and the specific progression from disorientation to crisis over the following 2 hours. She described the creek. She described the lantern. Dana asked her to describe what she had concluded, at the time, about whether Damien had attempted to locate her. She said she had concluded that he had not. Dana asked how she had arrived at that conclusion. She said, "Because no one came." The room was quiet for a moment. Dana moved on. At the end of the session, when Evelyn stood to leave, she looked at Damien for the first time since she'd entered the room. A single look. Not long. She looked at him the way you look at a place you've been and are not going back to what? Not with hatred, not with satisfaction, but with the particular kind of clear-eyed recognition that belongs to a person who has processed something all the way through to its end and has nothing left to add to it. He looked back at her. He said nothing. She left. Sylvie called her that evening. "Sentencing is scheduled for February," Sylvie said. "Given the cooperation agreement and Culp's testimony, the prosecution is confident. 22 to 28 years, federal, no parole eligibility for the first 15. "Okay," Evelyn said, a pause. I'm fine. You sound like someone who just spent 6 hours in a federal courtroom." "That's what I sound like then." She was in her car in the courthouse parking garage, engine off, the concrete around her holding the specific chill of a space that never gets warm. "What about the asset recovery timeline?" Sylvie gave her the numbers. The Viscari Holdings dissolution was proceeding across 4 separate legal proceedings: the federal seizure, the civil asset forfeiture, the family court petition regarding the marital estate, and a separate proceeding in 2 states related to the specific properties that had been purchased with documented laundered funds. The total recoverable amount was substantial. The portion allocated to the nonprofit structure was the 4th tranche, contingent on the resolution of the family court matter, and the family court matter was Evelyn's, which meant the money would come through her, which was a legal formality, but one that required her signature on a set of documents that she had been asked to review and had not yet reviewed. "I'll look at them this week," she said. "The building needs the 2nd tranche to fund the staffing through March," Sylvie said. "I want to make sure—" "I'll look at them this week, Sylvie." Another pause, and then Sylvie said something she hadn't said in 11 months of working together. "How are you doing, actually?" Evelyn looked at the concrete wall of the parking garage. "I'm better than I was," she said. "I'm not where I'm going yet." She paused. "That's the honest answer." "That's enough," Sylvie said. "But..." Giselle Marceau left New York in October. She called Evelyn 3 days before she left, a call that Evelyn had not expected and that lasted 11 minutes and was, for most of its duration, uncomfortable in the specific way that conversations are uncomfortable between 2 people who share a history. Neither of them chose and neither of them can fully account for. Giselle was going to Lyon. She had family there, a sister, 2 nieces, a mother who was not well. She had cooperated fully with the federal investigation. Her cooperation had been, Evelyn knew, both voluntary and strategic, which was fine. Most genuine cooperation was both, and the distinction between the pure motive and the practical one mattered less than the outcome, and the outcome had been complete. "I want to say something," Giselle said near the end of the call. "Go ahead," Evelyn said. "I knew what he was." A pause. "Not the full scope of it, but enough." I knew enough and I chose to stay because she stopped. Because it was comfortable, because it was easy, because walking away from that kind of life is harder than it looks from the outside. Another pause, shorter. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm saying I understood, when I opened that envelope, what it meant. And I chose to open it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. You did, she said. That's all you're going to say? That's all there is to say, Giselle. You made a choice. It mattered. You're not required to spend the rest of your life accounting for the choices you made before it. A long silence. I hope the program works, Giselle said finally. What you're building. It will, Evelyn said. It'll take time, but it will. They said goodbye with the particular awkwardness of two people who are not friends and are not enemies and have no clean category for what they are to each other. And Evelyn set her phone down and sat for a moment with the specific complexity of it, and then she put it away and went back to work. Leon Pruitt was found in a facility in Connecticut 3 days after Damien walked out of the townhouse. Not harmed, as Damien had said, but shaken in the way that a week of enforced isolation shakes a person who is already carrying the weight of a complicated choice. He was released. He was placed in federal witness protection pending the trial. He testified in April. He did so clearly and at length, and with the particular relief of a man who has been holding something for too long and has finally been permitted to set it down. Boyd Renna's debt was forgiven by the bookie, who was, by that point, operating as a formal federal informant with protections in place. And Boyd Renna himself was not charged. He had moved money he didn't know was dirty through a freight structure he hadn't created. And while his culpability was a matter of legal interpretation, Dana Fitch's office had assessed it and concluded that prosecution would not serve the broader case and declined to pursue it. Boyd Renna sold his condo in New Jersey, moved to his sister's place in North Carolina, and as far as Evelyn knew, had stopped betting on anything. Thomas Wren pleaded guilty in August to a reduced charge in exchange for cooperation. His attorney argued mitigating factors. The judge was unimpressed. He received 4 years. He would serve 2.5. Bernard Culp, whose cooperation had been the instrument of the RICO designation and whose testimony had been the architecture of the federal case's most consequential charges, received a cooperation agreement that reduced his exposure significantly. He had 30 years of operational knowledge, and he gave all of it methodically across 8 months of formal cooperation. I was 58 years old and looked older and would spend the next several years in a protected situation that was not comfortable but was survivable. Evelyn had spoken to him once, briefly, in the lobby of a federal building after one of the joint deposition sessions. She had not sought the conversation. He had been the one to stop, to turn, to look at her with the face of a man who has something to say and knows he has no particular right to say it. I didn't know, he said. About Ashford Pines. I didn't know what he did that night. She looked at him. When I found out, he said, it was after I'd already made the call, to the federal channel. But I want you to know, if I'd known earlier, he stopped. I don't know what I would have done earlier. I want to say I would have acted earlier, but I've been honest enough in the past year that I'm not going to lie about that now. She studied him. He was not asking her for anything. He was not even asking for acknowledgement. He was simply saying a true thing to the person it was true about, in the same bare, functional way she'd been saying true things across 11 months of legal proceedings. Thank you for the call, she said. Whenever you made it, it mattered. He nodded. They went their separate ways. Otto called from somewhere he didn't identify, a number she didn't recognize, voice slightly distorted by what she understood was deliberate processing, the habits of a man who had spent 8 years being extremely careful about his communications, and was not going to stop now just because the specific project they'd worked on together was concluded. The last of the files are cleared, he said. Your Claire Marsh digital footprint is fully dissolved. Chambers Street address is clean. Thank you, Otto. The nonprofit registration looks solid. The documentation chain from the asset recovery to the program funding is clean. Sylvie did good work. She did. A pause. You're going to be on public record now, he said. The program. Your name attached to it. I know. That's a change. Yes, she said. It is. She had thought about this. The specific exposure of attaching her name to something public, after 4 years of operating entirely in shadow. She had thought about it and she had decided that the shadow was not the destination. The shadow had been the instrument. What she was building now was not an instrument. It was the thing itself, the actual thing, the reason the instrument had mattered. And she was not going to build it under a false name or at a remove, because the people it was designed to serve would need to know, when they came through the door, that the person who had built it understood from the inside what they were carrying. Not because her story was a credential, she wasn't interested in using it as one, but because there was a specific kind of credibility that came not from expertise or authority, but from surviving. And the people she was building this for were people who needed to be in the presence of someone who had survived, and she was going to be that person in plain view. "You're going to be findable," Otto said. "I know. People are going to write about you. The trial coverage is already—" "I know, Otto." She kept her voice even. "I've read it." A pause. "Are you all right with that?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to think about things. Not the performative consideration of someone who has already decided and is taking the moment to appear thoughtful, but the actual consideration of a person sitting with a real question and giving it the time it deserves. "I'm working on it," she said. "But yes, I'm all right with it." Reuben Marsh died in January. She found out from Cassandra, who called on a Tuesday morning with her usual directness and said, "Reuben passed last night, his heart. He was in his sleep." Evelyn sat with it. She sat with it for a long time after the call ended. In the chair at her desk in the warehouse building that smelled of new drywall, with the boxes still in the hallway and the paint still drying on the walls of room 7. And outside the window, the January sky, the color of old iron. She had seen Reuben twice since leaving Verity. Once, 11 months ago, when she'd driven to the edge of the trailhead and he'd come out to meet her, the gray dog, old now, moving carefully, at his heels. He hadn't asked her anything about what she'd been doing. She hadn't told him anything. They'd stood on the edge of the tree line for 20 minutes in the cold, and he'd shown her where a family of foxes had denned for the winter, underneath a fallen birch at the edge of the creek, and she'd looked at the den and thought about the creek. And Reuben had not said anything about the creek, and she had been grateful for that in a way that didn't require words. The second time had been 6 months later. She'd brought coffee, which he'd received with the specific gratitude of a man who did not often have access to decent coffee. They'd sat on the porch of the main cabin and he'd told her about the winter, the snowfall totals, the condition of the upper trails, the state of the trap lines. And she'd listened with the same attention she'd given him 20 years ago in a different kind of cold, the attention of a person who understands that the information matters and the person delivering it matters more. She had not been back since. She should have gone back. She knew this and sat with it and did not excuse herself from it, because one of the things 4 years of compression had done was remove the particular human habit of self-exoneration from her emotional repertoire, and she was not going to pick it back up now just because grief was uncomfortable. She should have gone back. She hadn't gone back. Both of those things were true, and neither of them changed what Reuben Marsh had done with a lantern and a gray dog on a freezing morning, walking toward the sound of his dog's barking rather than away from it. She wrote a letter, handwritten, on paper, because Reuben Marsh had lived in a place without reliable electricity, and she was not sure whether Cassandra's community had a reliable postal address, and she called Cassandra to ask, and Cassandra gave her the address, and she wrote the letter and mailed it. She did not keep a copy. Some things didn't need to be documented. The program opened on a Thursday in February, 3 days after the sentencing hearing. 22 years, federal. No parole eligibility for 15. Dana Fitch had pushed for the upper range, and the judge, who had read every page of the evidence package and had said, in open court, that he had been on the federal bench for 19 years and had not encountered documentation of this completeness and scope, had agreed. Evelyn had not attended the sentencing hearing. She had read the outcome from the transcript that Sylvie forwarded. She had thought about what she felt and had found that what she felt was not the satisfaction she'd anticipated, not the clean release of a long-held thing finally concluded. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated, not incomplete, not disappointed, but different from the anticipated version in the way that real outcomes are always different from their anticipated versions, because you build the anticipation from the outside and then you live the outcome from the inside. And the inside is always more textured and less neat than the outside imagines it will be. She felt like it was over, She felt like something else was beginning. Those two things, sitting next to each other, without contradiction. The first resident of the program was a woman named Marcy, 53 years old. 14 years in a controlled domestic situation that had also had organized crime adjacency. Her husband had been a mid-level player in a distribution network in the Mid-Atlantic region, and her life had been structured around maintaining the appearance of a normal marriage while having no access to money, no independent relationships, no documentation that wasn't controlled by someone else. She had been referred through a domestic violence legal clinic that had assessed her situation as beyond their capacity and had found, through Sylvie's network, the program's intake coordinator. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in February with a single bag and the specific posture of a person who has been told, for a very long time, to make herself smaller. Evelyn met her in the common room on the ground floor. Not formally, not with program language, just two women in a room with good light and a table and coffee, because coffee was the most reliable bridging mechanism she knew. Marcy sat across from her and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it for a moment before she looked up. Are you the person who runs this place? She said. I am, Evelyn said. They told me, Marcy stopped. They said you understood this kind of situation, from personal experience. I do, Evelyn said. Marcy looked at her, studying her. The evaluation of a person who has spent years learning to read people quickly because reading people quickly had been a survival mechanism in the environment she'd been in, identifying moods, anticipating reactions, calibrating her own behavior accordingly. Evelyn recognized the look because she had worn it herself. You don't look... Marcy stopped again. I don't look like what you expected, Evelyn said. No. What did you expect? Marcy thought about it. Someone more... She made a gesture that was hard to translate and seemed to be reaching for a word that was somewhere between damaged and recognizable. Someone who looked more like it had happened to them. Evelyn looked at her. It happened to me, she said. And then a lot of other things happened to me. And then I built this. She set her own coffee cup down. The way it looks from the outside isn't a measure of the inside. You know that already. You've been managing the gap between those two things for 14 years. Marcy's eyes went wet. Not dramatically, not the sudden flooding of someone whose defenses have collapsed, but the slow, careful moisture of someone whose defenses are still in place but have encountered something they were not built for, which is simply the experience of being seen clearly and without judgment by another person. She nodded. Okay, Marcy said. Okay, Evelyn said. They sat together in the common room in the February light and drank coffee that was better than the building deserved yet. And outside the window, the snow was coming down over Philadelphia in the slow, steady way it does when it intends to stay. And the building held its warmth against it, and in room 7, the paint had finally finished drying. She drove north in March, not to Verity. The trail in was not navigable by car, and she hadn't yet arranged the time for the full hike, but to the ridge road that ran along the outside of the wilderness area, the road that was as close as you could get by vehicle to the place where Reuben Marsh had walked his trap lines every morning without exception. She parked on the shoulder. She got out. The March cold was different from the February cold, which was different from the January cold, which was different from the December cold that had been in this forest when everything started. She had learned, at Verity, to read the cold the way she read other things, specifically, without sentiment, as information about conditions and what they required. March cold meant the snowpack was loosening at the edges. It meant the creek would be running again in 4 weeks. It meant the foxes under the birch were probably emerging from the den into the first warmth, testing the air. She stood on the shoulder of the ridge road and looked at the tree line. The same tree line. Different in the way that everything is different when you bring different eyes to it, which is to say identical on its surface and entirely transformed by what you are bringing to the looking. She had stood at the edge of this tree line once before, in the dark, in a storm, in the last minutes before everything changed. She had stepped into these trees not knowing what was on the other side of them. She had come out the other side of them not knowing, yet what she was going to do with what she'd survived. She knew now. She looked at the trees for a long time. The cold worked at her face, the way it always did, finding the 2 spots on her left cheek where the frostbite had left its permanent signature, a slight alteration in the skin's texture, almost imperceptible unless you knew to look for it. She never forgot they were there. She had stopped minding. She thought about Damien, not with anger, not with the residual tremor of someone still processing. She thought about him the way she thought about the forest, as a place she had been, a condition she had survived, a thing that had happened to her and that she had happened back to with everything she had. She thought about him in a federal facility somewhere, growing older, watching the empire he'd built dissolve in court filings and asset seizures and the steady dismantling of everything that had given him his sense of dimension in the world. She did not feel sorry for him. She did not feel triumphant. She felt standing on the shoulder of a road in March, looking at a tree line, the particular and specific feeling of a person who has finished a long and difficult thing and is standing in the first quiet on the other side of it. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out the 2 damaged fingertips, not literally, because they were part of her hand and she carried them always. But she brought her left hand up and looked at it, the way she sometimes did in private, without the performance of acceptance and without the performance of being unbothered by it. Just looked. 2 fingertips. Second joint. The permanent toll of a night in a storm. Everything she had built in the years since, every name in the program intake files, every piece of evidence delivered, every person freed from a debt or a threat, or the specific darkness of a life controlled by someone else's cruelty. Every morning in that warehouse building, smell of new drywall and coffee, and the sound of Priya arguing about the program name, which Evelyn had finally given in on, and which was now going to be something Priya had proposed, and Evelyn had agreed was accurate. She curled her damaged fingers in, closed the fist. The hand still worked. She turned away from the tree line and walked back to the car. She got in. She started the engine and let it warm for a moment, and through the windshield the forest stood in its usual and permanent silence, keeping whatever it kept, returning whatever it chose to return, making of each person who entered it something that the person could not have anticipated from the outside. She put the car in drive. She pulled back onto the road. She drove south toward Philadelphia, toward the building that smelled of new drywall, toward the woman in room 3 who had an appointment with the program's legal consultant at 2 o'clock, toward Priya's ongoing opinions about the website and Sylvie's voice on the phone, and the 12 residents who would be in the building by April and the 20 who would be there by summer. She drove south, and the forest fell away behind her in the rear-view mirror, getting smaller and then gone. And the road opened up ahead of her the way roads do when you've been somewhere difficult and are heading somewhere you've chosen. And the morning light came through the driver's window at a low angle and sat on the dashboard and held still there, warm and uncomplicated, all the way to the highway. She did not look back. She had learned, finally, that looking back was not the same as remembering. And she intended to remember everything, every step in the snow, every choice in the cold, every morning she had woken in a wilderness cabin and decided, before her feet hit the floor, that she was still here and that still here was enough. And that enough was, in fact, everything. The highway opened up ahead of her. She drove. Otan. Damien Vescari served his sentence in a federal facility in the Northeast, where he spent 15 years before becoming eligible for any parole consideration. In that time, every territory his organization had held was absorbed by others. Every account was seized. Every arrangement he had carefully maintained over 30 years dissolved the way ice dissolves. First slowly, then all at once, and then simply gone, as if it had never been there at all. The program Evelyn Cross built served 47 residents in its first year and expanded to a second location the year after. It was not named after her. She had insisted on that. The forest on the northern ridge kept its snow through April, as it usually did. In the spring, the foxes under the fallen birch emerged into the warm air and scattered into the new growth, and the creek ran clear over its stones, and the trees stood as they had always stood, patient, indifferent, enormous, keeping nothing and returning everything in their own time to those who had the endurance to wait for it.